Chapter 151, Failure. Before Nick had a chance to appraise the ring, Helena rapidly grabbed it and put it on, showing that at the very least she could touch the thing. Unfortunately, it quickly became clear that the ring was a failure, as white and gold energy tendrils extended from the ring into Helena's arm, causing her to scream in pain. Nick immediately exerted his authority over the ring and had it grow and fall off her hand before falling onto the ground with a clink sound. The white and gold energy within her arm didn't vanish immediately, but after a few moments began to fragment and dissipate within her arm, returning it to normal. Ring name: Nazgul. Grade: Rare. Abilities: Autozizing, Spiritual Conversion, Bound, Parasite. Description: a dark ring capable of converting a soul into its maker's spiritual energy, ready to be absorbed to strengthen themselves. System: Appraisal, a terrible ring that only a twisted person could knowingly conceive, created by an up-and-coming ringsmith. That is so much worse than what I originally thought it was. Nick thought in horror while looking at the appraisal. Originally he had assumed that the ring was forcefully enslaving Helena, which was unacceptable, but instead it was converting her soul into energy that would grow his own power. The ring was basically digesting her for him to consume afterwards. While this is clearly a failure, it does solve one particular problem I had. Until now I couldn't extract the Horcrux soul shard from the diadem without exposing it to my own soul. But now I can use this ring to digest it instead. He thought seriously. I can understand your eagerness to gain a corporeal form, but please wait for me to check the ring first next time, he said to Helena sternly. She nodded and shivered with a fearful look at the ring still on the ground. It felt like I was slowly being broken down and fading away, she said, clearly traumatized from the incident. Nick nodded and explained what the ring did, which made the look on her face even more horror-filled. He then gave her the good news that the ring may be able to rid Ravenclaw's diadem of the soul shard without damaging it. He deserves it, so while I want nothing more than for you to destroy that foul thing on the ground, it still serves a purpose, she said, clearly having more hatred for Voldemort than the ring that almost ate her. Nick didn't really blame her, as the ring was an inanimate object that only did what its enchantments told it, while Voldemort had manipulated and used her to accomplish many foul deeds with the knowledge she gave him. Chief amongst that list was turning her mother's diadem into a receptacle for a soul shard tainted with the foulest of magics. That'll have to wait until next year, however, as I can't afford for the man to come after me right now. I'm not strong enough, Nick said, slightly frustrated at his own lack of power. Helena merely nodded in agreement when she heard this, as Nick had already told her about Voldemort's possession of Quirrell. He had also told her about the trap that the school was setting up against him, which was honestly the only thing stopping her from trying to expose Voldemort. Now I have to figure out what went wrong with the enchantment, Nick said while finally picking the ring and storing it away in greed. The intent and knowledge were perfect, so what was the thing that caused this? He fell deep into thought and started dissecting the forging attempt piece by piece until he found a problem. The word ghoul means wraith and has dark connotations, so it's possible that the combination of words I chose with the cold flame twisted the enchantment into this form. If so, then perhaps I should replace the word wraith, ghoul, with spirit, fia, which holds positive connotations, he thought seriously. Having already designed the next attempt, Nick called it a day and headed to the Great Hall for dinner. Once there, he saw the professors chatting away happily, and the students in the hall were a little different. Looking at Hagrid, Nick felt a little confused, as despite having his Christmas present for close to 3 weeks, the half-giant didn't seem to notice its effects. This wasn't to say that they weren't there or were not useful to him, but rather that Hagrid was not sharp enough mentally to figure out that the reason he found it easier to communicate with animals was due to the ring. It was rather ironic, really, that the man who was around these creatures quite frequently was oblivious to his sudden increase in ability in regards to them. This reminded Nick that McGonagall secretly approached him with a commission for a set of Playmaker rings for the Gryffindor Quidditch team to give them an extra edge. That was a total of 7 rings, all made to connect to each other to allow the team to collectively strategize. Chapter 152, Second Attempt. Nick's meal, like always, included quite a lot of proteins from various sources such as beans and meat. He also made sure to stock up on sweets, since he was starting to get low due to the amount he consumes per forging session. After dinner he went to bed in order to prepare for his day tomorrow, since it was one of the days he had herbology. The classes got progressively harder, as education typically does, and even Quirrell Mort's class was somewhat useful for their education despite his stuttering and feigned terror of the subject. Herbology, however, had proved to be the bane of Nick's existence, as despite becoming more elvish and less human by the day spiritually speaking, this didn't help his abysmal talent at the subject. According to Celebrimbor, this was because, unlike what many would assume, being an elf does not in fact make one good with plants. The whole myth around that was actually because elves tended to enjoy living in harmony with their surroundings, so their cities tended to have a lot of plant life in it. Much like any other race, however, they were each talented differently, and so some of them were terrible at some things and great at others. Clearly Nick was far more inclined towards mysticism and crafting than nature and herbology, leaving him miserable and often in need of help during the class. By this point he had lost count of the amount of times that he had been attacked or almost killed by the plants in the greenhouses. Hogwarts had a vast collection of magical plants, and quite a few of those were very dangerous to be around, such as the mandrakes that could kill you with their cries. He hadn't been exposed to those yet since that was part of the second-year curriculum, but he wasn't looking forward to it. The next day Nick made it through the 2 periods of herbology only being stabbed by a viper root a single time, which was great considering it was usually around 4 or 5 normally. Steve had unfortunately been banned from the greenhouses after trying to steal some silver-veined ivy, but Professor Sprout didn't really punish Nick for the actions of the little thief, since that was his nature. That didn't mean she didn't complain about it, however, while fussing over the injured plant. Still, Nick made it to the workshop mostly intact after class to begin his next attempt at making a ring wraith. Much like he had planned, he substituted the word ghoul with the word fia during the forging, which created a vastly different result than before upon completion. First was the color of the ring being red rather than blue. Unlike the previous ring, this one also didn't feel cold but warm and welcoming. None of this mattered if the effect of the ring was off, however, so Nick appraised the ring to determine his next course of action. Ring name, Nazfia. Grade, Rare. Abilities, Autozizing, Spiritual Solidification, Bound, Loyal. Description, a ring capable of allowing pure spiritual beings to take corporeal form but does not allow them to use magic. System appraisal, a strange ring that was made with ghost in mind, created by an up-and-coming ring smith. It's not a failure exactly, but not a success either. Give it a try. Nick said with furrowed brows. From his knowledge, the ring wraiths were powerful sorcerers, so despite the ring he made granting a corporeal form, it failed to make the resulting ring wraiths fill the role he had hoped for. The ring basically just turned the ghost into immortal muggles that also didn't need to eat or sleep. A great achievement to be sure, but a far cry from being good enough to prove very useful to him. Helena was much more cautious after almost getting eaten by the previous ring, and as such was much slower putting this one on. Still, the moment she did put the ring on, she yelped as a shimmer went over her transparent body before her ghostly levitation failed and she fell onto the ground. After not having any weight at all for over 1,000 years, she was caught off guard by the sudden shift but quickly recovered. She had a wide smile as she patted the floor and truly felt the texture under her fingertips. Shakily she stood up and immediately reached for a normal metal block and eagerly hoisted it into the air. I can feel and touch things, quick, give me a cookie. She said eagerly, and Nick obliged by handing over a chocolate chip cookie. She placed the cookie in her mouth and bit down on it, but looked ready to cry with a wide smile as she truly tasted something. Nick couldn't blame her really, as she had told him that after becoming a ghost one of the biggest things that they missed the most was being able to taste food. It was only after that they lost that ability that most ghosts realized how unappreciative they had been of it whilst they were alive. Chapter 153, Passing Time. Nick had to physically restrain Helena, however, when she started touching everything in the workshop, messing up his nice orderly space. He couldn't exactly kick her out of the workshop either, as until she figured out how to control the corporeality of the ring she would basically be telling Voldemort, hey, look at me. I know how to have a body despite being a ghost. Which would definitely not end well for Nick. That said, he wasn't just going to let her go messing up his workshop because she was happy to be corporeal again. You know you can't use magic right now, right? Nick asked after seeing her staring at the transfigured rope holding her in place. Obviously she was trying to use a wandless spell of some sort but couldn't. Why? She asked, frustrated at this revelation. If I had to guess, I'd assume I would need to include knowledge of veritology to the enchantment in order to allow spell casting. Right now though you are pretty much just a muggle. He said honestly. Arg. But that will take so long to get good at. She complained, clearly upset. Nick shrugged, since there was nothing he could do about that. Veritology was the art of crafting wands as magic foci for the wizards of the world, and was much deeper than it appeared at first thought. Nick honestly only knew the most common of information about this craft, such as that the wood must be from a magical tree and that the core must be from a magical creature. That was pretty much the entirety of his knowledge of the subject, leaving him in the awkward position of being unable to alter the enchantment on the ring. Eventually Helena simply had to accept that despite his frankly crazy level of enchantment skill for his age, Nick still had clear limits. Nick could only put the subject of ring wraiths on hold after that, as he needed to focus on several projects at the same time, and any more would burn him out. There was the homework from classes, the commission from McGonagall which was set to earn him a very pretty penny. Then there was his foundation solidification alongside his training to improve his power that was slow going, and finally the fact he refused to totally sacrifice his social life. All of this simply meant that he had no time to spare for an extra subject at the moment. Nick noticed immediately when Harry saw the conversation between Snape and Quirrell in the Forbidden Forest, as he suddenly had the courage to play Quidditch under the Potion Master's gaze in order to keep an eye on him. Nick also noticed that Quirrell was getting paler and more unhealthy looking the closer to the game it got, which Harry thought was because he was trying to breach the traps, but in fact was from the clash between Voldemort's soul and Quirrell's soul and body. The game finally came around, and unlike what many were expecting, Harry caught the snitch within 5 minutes of the start by flying within inches of Snape, much to the surprise of the man who paled as a result. Things were fairly quiet after that for quite a while, as nearly a month had passed, and besides the monthly sacrifice from Grindelwald nothing seemed to be happening. The teachers and Hermione had seemed to have gotten it into their heads to stuff as much information into the students as possible. However, what with summer and the exams coming, Nick was having none of it from Hermione though, since he had already proven himself to have already mastered the first year knowledge and then some, forcing her to leave him out of her mandated study sessions every day. Harry, Ron, Tracy, and Daphne weren't so lucky, however, as Hermione dragged them to the library after every class day ended. Nick wasn't idle throughout this time, however, as he had been forced to create a ring that suppressed his presence as it had started to get out of hand. His physical body had also started to change, though not dramatically, just simply things like his complexion. One thing he was grateful for, however, was that the change to his soul had finally finished, leaving his spiritual energy an equal mix of gold and white when he forged. This had also caused his magic to skyrocket, leaving him at the moment with an energy pool at about the middle of the 5th year students. To put this into perspective, Harry's magic was roughly at the level of a 3rd year student's at the moment from the boost the soul shard gave him. Unfortunately, Harry's magic also stopped growing so fast, which meant it had roughly settled at a certain improvement over time now, unless he started working it more. Chapter 154, Dragon Hatching. Nick had also been dealing with all of his own personal studies into the fundamentals of literally every topic he could at his current level. Attack magic, defensive magic, occlumency, legilimency, magi-zoology, potions, transfiguration and even divination, though he made little progress in this subject due to all the books on it sounding like a lunatic's ramblings and not because they were in code. The reason for this was because wizards tend to go crazy by trying peer into the future forcefully. Who knew? The topic giving him the most trouble after that one though was occlumency, as even at this point his first shield still hadn't solidified in his mind. He was unable to add a second layer of protection within his mind until that first one solidified. He had also improved considerably at hand-to-hand combat under the steadfast teaching, beatings, of Celebrimbor within his mindscape. He had also learned that the reason Celebrimbor was immune to any shifts in the mindscape was because, unlike Nick, who was only there in a single part of his being, Celebrimbor was there in two, mind and soul. Still, the system kept the elf on a tight leash, so the possibility of Nick being possessed was non-existent. Today was much like most of them recently, with most of Nick's friends being in the library studying. However, this time Hagrid also was in the library. Nick himself knew this because the half-giant was the opposite of stealthy, and because he was also in the library. Knowing that this would be his best chance to come into contact with a dragon until the Triwizard Tournament, he made his way over to where his friends were. He caught the middle of the conversation about the stone and its defenses before the topic was switched over to why Hagrid was in the library. "Just doing a bit of studying is all," Hagrid said defensively before retreating from the library with a couple of books tucked into his coat. Nick showed up right when the group was about to go visit Hagrid in his hut and said he'd join them. None of them found this odd, since he was a rather whimsical individual when they hung out normally. He was loads of fun to be around, but tended to do whatever it was he wanted even if it was odd. "Why were you in the library anyways? Aren't you set for the exams?" Ron asked curiously as they walked. Nick nodded. "I am good as far as the exams are concerned, but that doesn't mean that I can't still study other topics than the ones taught," Nick said with a shrug. "What was it this time, illusions, or some other blood-strange topic?" Ron asked with a roll of his eyes. "Don't get mad at me because your brothers have been tormenting you with those spells I gave them for Christmas," Nick said with a chuckle and a grin. "It's not just me, mate. Bloody everyone's been hit with those spells and we all hate them," Ron complained. "Just be glad he didn't give them any of the really powerful ones," Daphne said while giving Nick a knowing look. Nick just grinned wider. "I'm not apologizing," he said, completely unrepentant. "The least you could do was show some care for the consequences of your actions," Hermione said disapprovingly. "What is this gang up on me day? If so, 5-on-1 odds don't look so good, for you that is," Nick said with a laugh while smiling madly. They chattered away happily for the entire trip to Hagrid's hut that was filled with magical energy associated with fire. Nick sensed this immediately but didn't find it all that odd since dragons were beings of fire. An incubating dragon egg as a result likely released quite a lot of magical energy into its surroundings. Hagrid was happy to have guessed and had basically decided that he could only accept their group's interest in the stone in the castle. He flat out told them who all set up the defenses in order to get them to leave it alone, but only made them more interested in interfering due to their theories on Snape. "Could you crack a window or something? I'm boiling," Ron said while sweating. Hagrid shook his head. "No can do, I'm afraid," the half-giant said while shooting a glance to the fireplace that had a large round black object in the flames. "Hagrid, what is that?" Harry asked despite clearly having an idea what it was. Hagrid puffed up proudly. "Oh, that's a dragon egg, Norwegian Ridgeback if these books are right, won it in a game of cards off a fella in the bar yesterday," he said proudly. Chapter 155, Dragon Hatching, 2. Quick question, Hagrid, what are you going to do after the egg hatches? It's illegal to own dragons and the thing's bound to grow too big to hide in no time flat, Nick said seriously, and Hagrid stiffened and looked embarrassed. "You know, I hadn't much thought about it, but I'm sure I'll think of something," he said dismissively, but Nick wasn't going to accept that. "Perhaps you could send a letter to Newt's commander. He would surely be eager to help you with his love of magical beast," he suggested helpfully. "Mr. Commander's a busy man, wouldn't want to go bothering him over such a trifle," Hagrid said, trying to drop the idea. "Well, if he can't help us after we send him a letter, then we can make another plan after that, right?" Nick said honestly. Hagrid sighed in defeat. "You're right, of course, but I'd like to wait till the little ones hatch to send that letter," Hagrid said, and Nick accepted this since he also wanted to see a dragon hatch. It truly was a rare and valuable opportunity that under no circumstances should be wasted if it presented itself. Later in his mindscape, Celebrimbor had a very different idea in mind that was totally unacceptable. "You should kill the foul beast before it hatches. Dragons are greedy, violent monsters that need to be wiped out down to the last," the old elf said seriously. "Perhaps in your world that was true, but here they are basically just large fire-breathing lizards," Nick said, refuting the old elf while dodging a punch towards his face. "We shall see in the near future," Celebrimbor said before feinting a punch and kicking Nick in the face, snapping his neck back from the force. A week passed after that, and during breakfast Harry got a letter from Hagrid with only 2 words: "It's hatching," and they began to discuss the topic, which Malfoy overheard. The group skipped classes and headed straight to the hut, which was much cooler since Hagrid had put out the fire now that the dragon was hatching. The egg was placed on the rough wooden table and moved every now and then while scraping sounds came from its inside. Everyone watched with bated breath as the egg began to crack and split before finally fully opening in order to reveal the dragon whelp within. It was an ugly black thing with rough wrinkled skin and 2 large leathery wings in place of where its front legs should be. To Nick's magical senses, however, it was an entirely different story, as the magic in the air shifted and sang the instant the dragon truly came into the world. It was strange and beautiful at the same time, and truly made this trip worthwhile in his opinion, as it told him why no one seemed to be able to transform into a magical beast using the animagus ritual. If every magical beast birth is similar, then the reason no one turns into a magical beast is because they lack the worldly resonance that the magical beast gain at birth, he thought excitedly. Wizards never receive such a worldly resonance when they are born or unlock their magic, so they can only become the closest animal to their personality that is non-magical. In theory, if I can figure out how to activate the worldly resonance during the animagus ritual, I would be able to take the form of a magical beast during my change. Or I would die for fucking with the ritual in such a manner. More research is needed, he thought seriously. Nick had no doubt about what magical beast he would become if he succeeded, since his very soul itself was comprised of the integrated spirit of it. Becoming such a creature would definitely be highly advantageous for him, not to mention the prestige that would come along with such a feat. The only animagi to ever take the form of a magical beast, such a headline would bring awe and jealousy from across the world. It would also help soften the blow when he reveals his immortality in the future. The dragon was eyeing each and every person in the hut, but its focus narrowed in on Nick immediately. Curious as to why this was, Nick took a step towards the creature only for it to surprisingly back up fearfully. "I thought dragons were fearless and unruly, this one seems sorta. Not, I guess," Tracy said, confused. Nick knew from its reaction why the dragon had such behavior. It was in the presence of a larger, more powerful creature, or at the very least that's what its senses told it. Much like in the book, Malfoy also saw the dragon and scurried up to the castle, worrying most of the group about what he was going to do with this information. Chapter 156, Newt's Commander. Nick wasn't all that worried though, since even in the book Malfoy failed to achieve anything with this information save making the Golden Trio panic. "Well, it's a good thing that we were going to write to Mr. Scamander then, isn't it?" he said, and everyone's expressions lit up. "That's right. Malfoy would be helpless to stop us if we did that," Ron said, excited by the idea. "I'd honestly thought I'd have more time with little Norberta. But Mr. Scamander would probably know what's best for her," Hagrid said, teary-eyed and clearly upset. Nick noticed that Hagrid had gotten the gender of the little dragon correct this time, unlike in the book, and assumed this was because of the ring on the half-giant's finger. Still, after getting an absence slip from Hagrid for missing class, the group left Hagrid alone. Nick was the one who sent Newt Scamander the letter talking about the situation and asking for assistance. He also added the information on the core of his wand as an extra lure to get the man interested. Nick didn't think that Newt was naive enough not to notice this, but as a lover of all things magi-zoological, he probably couldn't resist the temptation anyways. A couple of days passed after that, and much like Nick thought, Newt did indeed notice the lure, as the letter he had received from the man joked about it. But Newt did confirm that he would be making a stop at Hogwarts to take the dragon without any issue. The part that made Nick grimace, however, was that in the letter Newt stated that he would be informing Dumbledore of this when he made his visit. Still, the pickup time was suspiciously the same as it was in the book, at a week and a half later. Nick informed his friends and Hagrid of this, and Ron somehow ended up with the letter, not that Nick tried to stop it. The events of the end of the year were coming up, and there were a few key things that needed to happen to set the stage for Voldemort's downfall at the end of it. First and foremost was the Forbidden Forest incident with Harry that needed to get detention in order to happen. At this point in time, Voldemort was struggling to stay in Quirrell's body, and as a result was nearly harmless at the moment. Nick was pretty sure the magic he used to hunt unicorns was the crippling sword rather than anything truly powerful, since once a centaur appeared he fled the area. If Voldemort could perform powerful magic, then he would have definitely taken the opportunity to kill Harry, but he didn't, which said he clearly wasn't able to. During this waiting period, Nick had to deal with a strange sickness that had him laid up in the hospital wing, shivering and sweating blood and throwing up chunks of flesh. Madame Pomfrey had no clue what was going on, as all of her diagnostic spells said he was perfectly healthy. Nick knew that they weren't lying, as he was healthy. However, he had reached the part of his transformation where his bone marrow, organs, and flesh was starting to be replaced by elven versions. While this was going on, his body was violently rejecting his human parts, causing this strange situation. It caused quite the sensation throughout Hogwarts, as despite Madame Pomfrey's, Snape's, and even Dumbledore's best efforts, Nick didn't improve much at all. If it wasn't for the fact that all of them found that the strange illness wasn't life-threatening for Nick, he would have been sent to St. Mungo's for further examination and treatment. This illness made the visit from Newt rather awkward for Nick, as he couldn't show the man the respect he deserves. Newt himself was an old but healthy man with wrinkled sun-tanned skin and short messy grey hair and a kind smile. "You needn't worry about the young dragon, as I have already taken care of it, though a couple of students were caught breaking curfew and given detention for it seems," he said from the foot of the hospital bed Nick was in. "Ha ha ha. Yeah, I am pretty sure I know which ones too, but I assume you are here in regards to the other thing that was in my memory," Nick said with a raspy voice and laugh. Coughing up flesh and blood had left his throat quite sore, so he sounded terrible. "Yes, I admit you certainly aroused my interest with this information. I had to do quite a lot of digging to find proof of your claims, but the information of this magical bird is incomplete, to put it mildly," Newt said honestly. Chapter 157, The Celestial Bird. "I won't lie and say I am an expert on the subject in front of such a skilled magi-zoologist such as yourself, but I have a little more information than anyone else," Nick said hoarsely. Newt took out a notepad and quill with an eager expression, ready to write down what Nick was going to say, but Nick weakly held up his hand to stop him. Removing a small empty vial out of greed, Nick shakily placed the tip of his wand against his forehead and slowly pulled out a silvery glowing thread from his head. Extracting a copy of a memory was an easy thing for someone who practiced occlumency or legilimency, and Newt's eye widened in surprise at the revelation that Nick was a practitioner of the mind arts. Still, he didn't say anything about it as Nick placed the memory into the vial and stoppered it. When his soul had fully fused with that of the celestial birds, he had gotten a few brief snippets of the creature's own memory that had survived within it until now. Out of them, a single one of them contained the creature's reflection as it flew over a body of water. Clearly it took the size of its Thunderbird parent, as it was very large judging from the size of the fish in the water below. It had 2 sets of wings of equal size, and its feathers were an equal mix of white, gold and crimson. It had 3 long tail feathers that trailed behind it as it flew, and it was hard to see but had a crest of pure golden-colored feathers around its neck and probably its head as well. "I'm sorry that I don't have anything else for you, but I hope that proves useful for you," Nick said with an apologetic smile while handing over the vial shakily. It seems that I'll need to impose on Dumbledore to use his pensieve before I can say for sure, but you seem trustworthy enough. And if it's not too much trouble, might I examine your wand to see if I might be able to glean anything from the feather within? Newt asked awkwardly, since asking for a wizard's wand is very impolite. Nick chuckled. I am not some sort of pure-blooded prude, please help yourself, though I would prefer you not leave whilst it is in your possession for your own safety. It reacts badly when it seems someone intends to steal it knowingly or otherwise. Nick warned seriously. Newt seemed to hesitate slightly at this warning, but still took the wand from Nick's shaky hand and gently examined it. He had a nostalgic look on his face as he looked at the wand for a few minutes before handing it back to Nick, who admittedly felt rather odd not having it himself. It would seem that much like both of its parents, the bird was rather prideful, as it actively denied my examination. Newt said, not seeming bothered at all. Nick shrugged. It's my wand and I barely understand it as well, so don't feel too bad about it, he said reassuringly. I never said I didn't learn anything, only that the wand tried to stop me. Next said with a smile. Well, now you have my curiosity, please do go on. Nick said, very interested in what Newt may have found. The first thing you need to understand is that feather wasn't from an adult bird, Newt said seriously, and Nick was left with a stunned expression. According to Ollivander, wizards long ago who were on average much more powerful than modern wizards all failed to even approach the bird, and yet it wasn't an adult despite such power. Don't misunderstand me, boy, I am not talking about physical maturity here, as it was an adult in this regard, Newt said after seeing Nick's expression. At this point Nick was just confused. How can you be fully mature and yet not an adult, he wondered, only giving himself a headache. To better explain, I suppose I should explain why, despite being technically immortal, phoenixes are so very rare, Newt said, getting Nick's attention again. When the rare instance of a phoenix mating occurs, a single egg is laid by the pair of mating birds and guarded fiercely. After hatching, the chick grows up and develops under its parents' education on how to act until the day of its first rebirth arrives. Unfortunately, the chances of a phoenix surviving its first rebirth is extremely low, and they can truly die if they fail, while eternity awaits if they succeed. This, alongside how rare it is for phoenixes to mate, means that there are very few of the majestic creatures in the world, he explained with a sad expression. Chapter 158, Incoming Confrontation. A phoenix is not considered an adult until it survives its first rebirth, and there are signs within the feather that it never underwent rebirth, hence not being an adult. Thunderbirds have a similar phenomena that involves the freshly hatched birds needing to survive a violent thunderstorm from inside it, which lets them also be reborn from a storm. In my opinion, the hybrid likely also had a harsh and difficult to survive tribulation it needed to go through to also obtain eternity. Perhaps it left that feather knowing that it would fail whatever this tribulation was, Newt said seriously. Did it fail though? What if the condition for its rebirth simply hadn't been met quite yet? Nick wondered seriously, but didn't voice these concerns. This wasn't an impossible idea either, as phoenixes had to be reborn through fire and thunderbirds through storms, so it made sense that a celestial bird may have an even more intense process. Logic said that something like a firestorm might be needed, but magic went by strange rules in regards to things like this, so there was honestly no telling. Other than its age, I learned that the creature seemed to have the elemental affinities of both of its parents, most likely giving it an astounding mastery of fire, water, and air, as well as transfiguration magic. From what Dumbledore has told me, this gift in transfiguration passed to you, as well as a few other traits, namely your eyes, Newt said honestly, and Nick nodded in agreement. The final thing I was able to learn about the creature, however, is of great concern towards you as someone bound to the feathers so tightly. This creature seems to have been able to store a part of its spirit within the feather and may try to possess you if your will isn't strong enough, Newt warned before bidding farewell and leaving Nick to his thoughts. Nick wasn't actually concerned over that final warning, however, as that part of spirit had already been perfectly integrated into his own soul, and you can't possess yourself without time travel or multiverse shenanigans. Speaking of perfect integration, Nick had also been taking on some faintly avian features during this fun time of body transformations. His nails, for example, were now darker and harder than normal. His eyes had also changed slightly so that he now had the piercing gaze that eagles were so famous for. There was also a slight change in the structure of his face, not much, but his features had become sharper and more pronounced. Clearly the elven portion of his transformation was dominant, so he still looked human. Interestingly though, his ears had only gained a slight point that was barely even noticeable. That was pretty much the full extent of his external transformation, and all that was really left was for his internal parts to get replaced. As it turned out, this took him close to a month total to get done. Many of the professors advocated having his exam scores bumped up if he didn't score well from lack of study, but much to all but McGonagall, Snape, and Flitwick's surprise, he not only passed the exams but aced all of them, even herbology. To be fair though, the herbology exams were on paper rather than practical applications, so his lack of affinity for plants played no part. Thankfully, practical understanding of the material wasn't very important, and only a specific display was needed for subjects like charms, potions and transfiguration. Harry had his run-in with Voldemort in the forest much like in the book and had been distracted ever since. Nick was amazed his friend had even gotten through the exams with how horribly distracted he was at the time. The temperature had begun to pick up as well as summer rapidly approached, and the entire wizarding world had become numb to Grindelwald's sacrifices every month. Many were greatly concerned about what he needed them for, but the actual headlines themselves no longer stirred panic, as he hadn't done anything else in the entire time he was free. This didn't mean that the wizarding community didn't have a small army search the globe for the man and his followers. On the final day of the exams, which involved history of magic, Nick purposefully made himself scarce afterwards. Harry is going to be making his move against Voldemort tonight, and I will be using this opportunity to get rid of the soul shard in the room of requirement while they clash. As much as I would like to take part in the test with them, my part is just as important. Nick thought seriously as he navigated the halls and secret passages expertly to reach his workshop. Chapter 159, Secret Destruction. Helena didn't stop painting when he entered the room, despite being in her corporeal form, somehow knowing that it was him rather than anyone else. Get ready, tonight we are going to rip the soul shard out of the diadem, Nick said briskly as he locked the door behind him. Helena's hand trembled, ruining the painting she was working on when she heard him. She calmed herself and placed the brush she was using into a cup of water to clean it. Why now? She asked curiously. He is going to be busy trying to snatch a stone that is almost definitely a fake from the tests protecting it, Nick said seriously. But wouldn't he know what we did and come after he's done? She asked, concerned for his safety. Nick shook his head. I can't say how I know, but he won't be able to come after me for a long time, if ever, he said before sitting on the ground cross-legged and started to meditate to make sure he was in peak form for whatever traps Voldemort may have placed around the diadem. Nick wasn't delusional enough to think the man wouldn't prepare for the case of Helena telling him where and what the diadem was. Hours passed by and soon it was after dinner, and Harry and the others should have already begun their trip through the tests. Nick's eyes snapped open and shined with determination as he stood up and transfigured his robes into thick black combat jeans and a tight black t-shirt with long sleeves so that he had the ability to move freely. On one hand he had greed, Sanner, and 3 rings of protection, while on the other hand he had another 5 rings of protection. These were in case he wasn't fast enough to cast the shield charm on his own should any of the defenses be of that sort. Helena herself had taken for ghostly form and was floating nearby holding the hammer with fully intent on using it if she had to. Give me the hammer and I'll give it back when we get to the room, since it'll just slow you down otherwise, Nick said seriously, and Helena handed it over without a word and shot through the wall of the castle to rush towards the 7th floor, not wanting to waste a moment. Nick also left the workshop with a focused gaze and his wand held firmly in his right hand. He took all the shortcuts he could to the 7th floor, avoiding the suddenly tight security on the 3rd floor entirely. 10 minutes later Nick stood outside the blank wall across from the tapestry of Barnabas the Barmy, trying to teach trolls ballet. I need a place to hide things, he thought firmly 3 times while pacing back and forth, causing a familiar wooden door to appear. Taking a deep breath to steady his nerves, he reached out and pushed the door open. What he found was a room filled with various objects that had been stacked in hazardous piles, filling the entire room with a thin walkway to travel deeper within. Fly overhead to see if you can spot the diadem and call out if you do, Nick said to Helena, who nodded and floated up and over the piles of items, both trash and treasure, in equal parts. Once she had gotten a good distance away, Nick started his own journey while searching each and every inch of the piles carefully. His magic senses were useless here, as the amount of cursed object in this room was no laughing matter. The corrupt and dark dissonance that these objects let off made finding a specific magic signature basically impossible. Nick was patient, however, and carefully searched through the room for the next 3 hours before finally finding his target. It sat unassumingly on a wooden mannequin, but Nick's magic senses picked up the intense dark power on the diadem as well as the lines of spells cast on both the mannequin and the objects surrounding it. Helena, over here, he called, and shortly afterwards Helena appeared with a whoosh sound. That is indeed Mother's diadem, and the protections around it are no laughing matter. What's your plan? She asked without looking away from the unassuming-looking silver headpiece. How many of those enchantments are lethal or close to it? Nick asked calmly. Helena paused for a moment to count them. 13, and one that swaps the mannequin for the person who touches it, she said honestly. And out of all of those, are there any that can affect a ghost such as yourself? Nick asked with a devious grin as Helena suddenly noticed how pointless these spells were against a ghost who can switch between corporeal and not at will. Chapter 160, Secret Destruction, 2. Helena immediately turned corporeal and calmly walked over to the heavily trapped part of the room and purposefully began to set the curses off. Nick watched on in amusement as these vile magics were strike Helena before being dispelled by her returning to her incorporeal state, rendering them without a target to affect and thus dissipating. The soul shard in the diadem was clearly starting to get worried as it tried and failed to tempt Nick to keep it rather than destroy it. Nick merely sneered at this paltry attempt at spiritual manipulation, as he was a master at controlling his own soul, making him disdainful at such a pathetic attempt. Soon all that was left was the swapping trap of the mannequin, and the moment Helena triggered it she turned incorporeal, causing the diadem to fall to the floor with a clatter instead of settling on her head. The soul shard was desperate to survive and redoubled its efforts to manipulate Nick into sparing it regardless of its own energy expenditure. Nick felt irritated at feeling the constant pressing of this spiritual magic at his mind and flared up his own spiritual energy, squashing it ruthlessly. Nick's soul was much denser and of a higher quality than any other known wizard's soul, so the weak spiritual energy of a mere shard of a normal soul stood no chance of resisting at all. Removing the Nazgul ring from greed while maintaining his suppression of the soul shard, Nick carefully lowered it onto the peak of the diadem while making sure not to touch the cursed thing himself. Like a shark after sensing weakness in a prey item, the ring auto-sized to tightly fit onto the diadem, and a terrible scream filled the air as it went to work on the soul shard. Helena watched on coldly as the diadem slowly was overtaken with a gold and white radiance as the soul shard was converted to Nick's spiritual signature before the energy retreated into the ring that started to glow while it waited for Nick to claim the power it obtained for him. She was bothered by the emotions she felt coming from the ring, as though it were a dog seeking praise from its owner despite having just forever destroyed part of a soul. Yes, the ring seemed to have a life of its own and seemed to wish nothing more than to be of service to its creator. Nick, much like Helena, felt repulsed by the ring but controlled himself and didn't move to destroy it, but picked it up and sucking in a sharp breath as the ring eagerly turned over the energy it had obtained. The energy flowed into his body and directly into his soul, causing it to start to stretch and expand to accommodate it. Once the energy stopped flowing, Nick felt physically sick with a hammering headache and an intense case of nausea, like he had eaten far too much despite not eating anything other than breakfast today. His veins bulged out and his skin turned red as his body itself also struggled to contain his soul that had outgrown it suddenly. Luckily his extremely fit body was just barely strong enough to stay together under this internal pressure. "It's done, you may retrieve the diadem now," Nick said while sounding out of breath from panting. Helena turned corporeal once more and gently picked up the silver headpiece with a sad expression as she looked it over and found that the process of becoming a Horcrux had destroyed most of the enchantments on it. The few left were the less important ones like preservation and self-cleaning enchantments, while the enchantment that increased intelligence lay shattered into many fragments that would be nearly impossible to restore. She reported this to Nick, but he was surprisingly totally unfazed by it, as though he had long suspected this to be the case. With a bit of thought, Helena noticed that Nick had never once seemed actually tempted by the enchantments on the diadem, but much more concerned about the soul shard within it instead, which in hindsight made sense with his mastery of spiritual energies. If anyone was aware of how much damage shoving soul energy, much less a piece of a soul, might do to enchantments, it would be him. Figuring this to be the case, she was no longer surprised at his reaction and watched as he winced while placing the headpiece into greed. "Let's go, we are done here for now," Nick said tiredly as he started to walk with a strained expression. Thanks to the fact that most of the staff was busy dealing with the aftermath of Harry's clash with Voldemort, Nick managed to sneak into the Gryffindor dorm room and pass out on his bed from exhaustion. Chapter 161, Aftermath. Nick slept like a log for the entire night and most of the morning, only waking up at around lunchtime. "Ugh, need to remind myself not to have any plans after absorbing the other Horcruxes. I feel like I weigh an extra 100 pounds, he complained immediately. Thanks to having had time to digest his gains a little, he no longer had veins popping out or red skin, but he felt uncomfortably heavy and bloated still. Sluggishly Nick got up from the bed and went into the dorm bathroom for a shower, as he had slept in his clothes overnight and he was covered in dried sweat. The hot water rolling over his body did wonders for the aches in it while washing away the filth on him. After his shower he used a quick spell to clean his clothes and then got dressed before leaving the dorm. It came as no surprise to Nick that the news of Harry, Ron, and Hermione braving the Forbidden Corridor and get almost entirely hospitalized for it filled the castle. Hermione was uninjured, but both of the boys had various injuries on them, such as cuts and bruises and even broken bones in the case of Ron. McGonagall may have made the giant chess set non-lethal for the children of the school, but she didn't nerf it enough not to break bones. Ron had already been patched up and kicked out of the hospital wing by Madame Pomfrey, but Harry had a wounded mind from Voldemort's last desperate attack on him in phantom form and was thus still unconscious. He would be fine though, according to the less than patient medical professional. Nick was relieved at this outcome as he was truthfully worried that his presence would mess up this event. Nick had long noticed that the world itself seemed to be trying to keep the canon events on track, which made him think that there might actually be some truth to that prophecy after all. There was honestly no other explanation as to why things seemed to play out eerily similar to the book despite Nick pretty actively interfering in events. The biggest change he had noticed was that Harry was free of his horrid aunt's family and Grindelwald's actions. There was honestly very little beyond that truly affected the story of the books all that much. One would think that the inclusion of Daphne and Tracy into the group would count, but no, in the final clash it once again came down to the Golden Trio. Nick was pretty sure that it would end up this way for most of the story, or it would have if Nick didn't plan to heavily detrain the future events. An example of this was how he planned to free Sirius legally over the summer while also apprenticing under a wizard over the summer as well. That reminds me that I still need to put in an application for that as well so I can get a list of options. Nick thought calmly. After visiting Harry in the hospital wing briefly without permission from Madame Pomfrey, he made his way to McGonagall's office. Knocking on the door, he waited for an invitation to enter, which came moments later. "You may enter," McGonagall's tired voice said from behind the door, so Nick pulled the door open. McGonagall saw who it was inside. "I take it you are not here to make my job harder like your friends, correct?" she asked slightly rudely. Nick chuckled, not bothered at all. "My hands are quite clean of that whole affair, you know," he said honestly. "This time it seems, but don't think I am blind to the large instances of your presence being missing, however," she said with a warning tone. Nick shrugged. "I am not here about all of that, however, but rather to discuss my housing arrangements for the summer. I would like to formally apply for the apprenticeship program," he said with a small grin. McGonagall sighed and rubbed her forehead. "I should have guessed you would choose that option, as you don't seem the sort to sit idle for any real length of time. I will approach you within the week with a list of applicants for the position of your teacher. If that is all, please see yourself out and do take care to keep out of trouble, would you?" she said, almost pleading at the end. Nick merely grinned and walked out of the office, closing the door behind him, and made his way to the workshop nearby. Once there, he transfigured himself a comfy chair and pulled a book on veritology from Greed to relax with the door open so any visitors could enter if they wished. Chapter 162, Downtime. As it just so happened, he did indeed get a visitor in the form of a boy with slicked back short blonde hair and green-lined robes, Draco Malfoy. Nick couldn't help but raise an eyebrow in surprise at the fact that the boy was alone as well. Malfoy looked around the workshop curiously before his eyes focused on Nick on his comfy chair. "Good evening, Malfoy, what can I do for you?" Nick asked with a polite smile. As much as it killed him, Nick did know the importance of pure blood etiquette thanks to Daphne drilling it into his head whenever she could. "You were the one who created those Quidditch rings that the Gryffindor team has been using, correct?" Malfoy asked, getting straight to business. Nick nodded. "Indeed I did, as I received a commission for 7 linked Playmakers rings. I am told they have been put to good use as well," Nick said, politely hinting at the final Quidditch match coming up that the Gryffindor team had thoroughly prepared for thanks to the rings. The corner of Malfoy's mouth twitched in irritation, but the boy kept his cool, which was pretty impressive for him. "I would like to commission a ring much the same as those, but of better materials, of course. Name your price," Malfoy said seriously. Nick just smiled widely and pulled out his order notebook and his phoenix feather quill to jot down the order. "Anything specific in mind? As you can see, I have quite the selection of materials, and depending on your choice the price will vary greatly," Nick said, pointing to the neatly arranged stacks of metal. "Though if you need it, I also have a list of my current material stock as well," he said, pulling a sheet of paper from Greed and offering it. The paper contained a neatly written list of each metal at his disposal as well as their respective prices on the open market. Malfoy took the paper but paled when he reached the really rare stuff like adamantium and star metal that had prices at nearly 1,000 galleons an ounce at minimum depending on purity. Nick was sure that before reading that list Malfoy had been pretty close to saying spare no expense, but definitely decided against it after reading the list. The pure blood house of Malfoy could easily afford the price, of course, but it was still unacceptable to pay so much for what amounted to entertainment. "Gold with silver inlay and a natural emerald as well," Malfoy eventually said after some thought. Nick quickly drew up a rough sketch of a Playmaker ring and added a small emerald to it located right at the head of the broom and the bristles of it as well. He then labeled where it would be gold and where it would be silver. "Like this?" he asked, handing the sketch to Malfoy for confirmation. The boy looked the design over and pointed at a few spots that he wanted different, but the design was mostly the same in the end. Nick went over prices in his head for material, work, and specific design before speaking. "The ring will cost you 40 galleons even and be more powerful than the normal versions as well, for reasons I won't get into. Is this acceptable?" Nick said seriously. Malfoy thought about it for a moment before nodding and reaching into his robe for a coin pouch that he counted out 20 golden coins from. "Half now and half when the job is done," he said, and Nick nodded in agreement. "A pleasure doing business with you," Nick said with a wide smile, but Malfoy merely hummed before leaving the workshop. "It still surprises me how avaricious you are despite having the entire fortune of the Ravenclaw house in your hands," Helena teased with a smirk. "You can never have enough money, I'll have you know," Nick said, defending himself. Helena rolled her eyes at him but didn't argue since she was well aware how greedy Nick was. He had once made an enchanted ring to ward off and kill slugs for profit after all. Nick didn't get another visitor for another 2 hours, letting him get a decent way into the Veritology book. This time the visitor wasn't a student but one Madame Hooch, who looked around the workshop with much the same curiosity that Malfoy did. Unlike Malfoy, however, she was here for an entirely different reason than he was. "Madame Hooch, what can I help you with?" Nick asked with genuine surprise to see her in his workshop. "I came to inquire if you were planning to play Quidditch next year," she said honestly without any wasted time. Chapter 163, Slight Change in Plans. Nick frowned at this as he had made sure that his talent at flying hadn't ever been too pronounced during class. As far as he was concerned, what he had shown wasn't nearly good enough for her to personally come to him in regards to if he planned to play Quidditch. "Tisk, I thought so after Sinistra told me of your little flight Christmas night. It was clear in class that you weren't really going all out, but what I can't understand is why? What was stopping you this whole time?" she asked with honest confusion. Nick groaned after hearing what she said, as he had totally forgotten about the astronomy professor, who certainly had a reason to regularly stare at the sky. "If you insist on knowing, then it was simply because I didn't want to waste my time. Quidditch is a time sink that demands huge amounts of time training and is limited by an assortment of rules and regulations that sucks all the fun out of flying, in my opinion. To answer your question about playing next year, then no, I will not be." "Is that all?" Nick said seriously. Madame Hooch visibly recoiled from Nick's scathing tone of her favorite pastime. She looked at Nick deeply for a few moments before shaking her head and leaving with a disappointed expression. "Rather harsh that time, no?" Helena asked, concerned at how he seemed to snap at the professor over an innocent-looking series of questions. Nick took a deep breath to calm himself. "You're right, I overreacted this time. I'll need to find a way to apologize, it seems," Nick said with a sigh. "It just made me so angry that she asked me to settle for a cloud when I could have the whole sky," he said honestly. Nick relaxed after that for the rest of the week after having ordered the emerald for Malfoy's ring. Harry had woken up 3 days after the incident and spoken to Dumbledore, who arrived there shortly after he woke up, since Madame Pomfret told him. A thing that made Nick frown, however, was that during the clash between Harry and Voldemort, the Dark Lord had apparently cursed by saying, "How dare that brat touch what is mine?" Clearly Nick and Helena had set off the man's traps right when he was in confrontation with Harry, alerting him to the defenses he placed being triggered. "It doesn't matter, since he won't be able to return for at least another 3 years, and by that point I might have already destroyed all of his Horcruxes," Nick thought with a sigh. The original plan had been to systematically destroy the cursed artifacts one by one before having Harry deal the final blow to the man, while the Dark Lord was none the wiser. Now though, Nick had about 3 years to get the job mostly done before the man came looking for revenge. At the end of the week, the exam scores were announced early in the morning, with Nick in first place and Hermione in close second, followed by Daphne in third. Harry, Tracy, and Ron passed, but only with average scores compared to the 3 brains of the group. There was quite the uproar during dinner when the Great Hall was decorated with Slytherin colours for winning the House Cup, but right before they could gloat about it, Dumbledore happened. Nick found it funny how the man preached about unity and healthy competition before directly rigging the House Cup for Gryffindor to win. Tracy and Ron had a whole back-and-forth session about who should have rightfully won the House Cup over the next couple days, but Nick wisely stayed out of it. Finally May, which was the final month at Hogwarts, came around, and Nick learned that the religious wizarding practices of Beltane actually made some sense. They had been outlawed, of course, but the premise was that this date was when the whole planet had a sharp upsurge in magical energy. Nick found out the hard way that it was true too, as he was reading one moment and the next gushing blood from his nose as his magical senses were overloaded. The surge didn't last long, merely 3 hours, but Nick was magically blind during that window, which made him uncomfortable. He had finally finished digesting his gains from the energy he received from the Horcrux as well during that holiday, causing his own magical energy reserves to grow by a lot. If before he was about the middle of the 5th year in terms of amount, he was now a good way into the 6th year. This was to say that right now his magic was about as potent as an adult wizard who wasn't very good in school. Chapter 164, Unforeseen Options. Much like he had been told, McGonagall had indeed given him a list of applicants for the apprenticeship program. Contrary to what most would guess, this list wasn't a made-to-order thing where people could apply to mentor a specific student after learning who they were. In truth, at the start of every year the ministry briefly accepts the applications of people who wanted to mentor a student over the summer for whatever reason. Most of the applicants were people who needed an extra set of hands over the summer or were searching for someone to inherit their business as they lacked any family to fill the role. The list Nick received showed this perfectly, as it listed the person's name as well as their reason for applying to mentor a student. He quickly noticed 4 names on the list, however, that were different than the others, as next to the name there was a mark in the shape of a star. After asking McGonagall about what this meant, he learned that it was a mark of exception to show that those people had specifically asked for him by name to be mentored by them. These people were Garrick Ollivander, Remus Lupin, Cornelius Fudge, and most surprisingly of all, Albus Percival Woolforth Brian Dumbledore. Helena was laughed loudly when she saw this list, as it was so full of political maneuvering that it could not be any more obvious. Remus Lupin was definitely on this list on behalf of Dumbledore to spy on Nick over the summer, and while he would probably teach Nick seriously as well, it didn't change the fact he would be spying on Nick. Dumbledore himself being on the list came as a great surprise, but Nick was sure that it definitely wouldn't end very well if he took that option. Fudge was probably only on the list thanks to him literally being the Minister of Magic and thus capable of altering the list at any time. Honestly speaking, the only option on this list of special people who was genuinely interested in interacting with Nick without secretive motives was Ollivander. Nick didn't discount the normal names on the list though, and thoroughly looked them over and even found a couple of interesting names on it. For example, there was Theodore Tonks, Alastor Moody, and Gringotts Bank itself. The last one especially caught Nick off guard, as he hadn't expected that the bank would seek to include wizards into itself in such a manner. I suppose it makes sense that they would want to poach talented orphans from a young age though, he thought with a shrug. Ugh, why did there actually have to be more than one good option? He complained mentally. Honestly speaking, Ollivander, Moody and Tonks all presented Nick with unique benefits for learning under them. In Ollivander's case, the man was the most well-known and respected wandmaker in the entire world, to the point that other communities actually had people come over to England to specifically buy a wand from him. Learning from Moody, on the other hand, would basically allow Nick to understand dueling, survival, dark arts, and whatever else the most respected auror to ever live had to teach. Sure, Moody might be a bit unhinged, but not a single person would deny that after everything he has seen and done, he deserves his own eccentricities. Tonks, on the other hand, had 2 benefits to learning under for Nick specifically. First was that it would help Nick make sense of the strange legal aspect of the wizarding world, as the man was a good wizarding lawyer. The final benefit, however, was that it would make having Sirius released from Azkaban drastically easier, thanks to the man being married to Sirius's cousin Andromeda Tonks née Black. Nick may have planned to approach the lawyer to begin with for this case as well, which also certainly helped. Unfortunately for Nick, he could only choose a single mentor for the summer, so he needed to really put thought into his choice. Thankfully, the final month of the school year was less about learning and more about the teacher preparing them to go through summer without getting rusty. Nick spent most of this month hanging out with his friends while fulfilling the last-minute orders he had. Malfoy was insufferable for a few days after Nick turned over the shiny gold and silver playmaker ring with the emerald to him. But according to Daphne, one of the graduating upperclassmen in Slytherin had taken the boy aside and gave him a stern lecture on not bragging overly much, as it shone badly on their house, which made Malfoy tone it down a bit. Chapter 165, Final Days of the Year. By the second to last week of school, Nick had finally made his choice based on the most precious opportunity that each possible mentor gave him. In the end, he chose Ollivander, since he honestly seriously needed knowledge on veritology for his ring wraith project. It also helped that he was pretty sure that Ollivander would be more than happy to allow him to take the time to set up Sirius's release. If Nick wasn't mistaken, the mentoring application from the man was likely just so he could gather data on his wand rather than Nick himself. Ollivander was nothing if not dedicated to his craft, which was a trait Nick could respect as a craftsman himself. McGonagall raised an eyebrow when Nick turned in his choice, considering the options available to him, but didn't comment on it. After that, Nick didn't have any pressing matters to take care of, so he simply relaxed. On the day before school was set to end, he stored away all the tools he may need over the summer holiday, including his furnace and some metal, before double-checking his friends' plans for the summer. Harry was going to be staying with the Weasleys over the summer, while the rest were going back with their own families. Daphne and Tracy were planning to relax and only otherwise do their homework during this time, and Harry and Ron was pretty much the same. Hermione was going to France for vacation with her parents and planned to visit that country's magical community as well. Nick got a bunch of weird looks when he explained how he was basically going to be learning and settling some matters during summer. That sounds bloody exhausting. Don't you plan to take a break at all? Ron asked, worried. Nat, I have far too much on my plate to rest easy right now, what with having to fix my until recently extinct family's finances and political power. Not to mention the sheer amount of catching up I have to do on the front as well, because as it turns out being functionally extinct for 1,000 years does in fact mean we are massively outdated in a few ways. Nick said casually with a shrug. The whole group grimaces at the thought of the work he had ahead of him. I don't envy you at all. Daphne said honestly, and the rest nodded in agreement. Nick merely just grinned and laughed. Just watch as I lift the 1,000 years of dust of my name and let its radiance illuminate the world, he said with a determined and prideful tone. Tracy rolled her eyes. Yes, you are so amazing, none of us mere mortals can dare to stand in your presence, she said sarcastically, and everyone laughed. The final day Nick woke up to find his luggage trunk missing from the end of his bed, but he didn't panic as he knew the house elves had already sent it to the carriages. Getting up, he got dressed in the spare set of jeans and blue t-shirt he had in greed, which was a bit tight due to his growth over the past school year. A quick transfiguration fixed this problem, leaving him comfortable and also fully covered. No one else was awake at the moment since it was dawn, so Nick left the dorm room quietly. He activated the house elf calling bust in the common room, summoning one of the wrinkled floppy-eared tiny servants to himself. I need about 10 loaves of lembas bread for over the summer, could you help me get it before I leave? He asked politely. Sir Ravenclaw can leave it to Tinky, the house elf said respectfully and eagerly before vanishing from the common room. Nick was surprised that none of the elves had noticed that he himself had mostly become an elf, but Celebrimbor had a theory on the matter. According to him, it was possible that the elves of this world had literally nothing to do with the type of elf that Nick was becoming. As a result, Nick was merely treated as a student from one of the founding families by the house elves, which was to say a little better than everyone else. Knowing that he wouldn't get in trouble today for it, Nick openly left the common room to walk around the castle to soak in its sights for the last time in a long time. He of course made sure to stop by the workshop and pick up Steve, since the little troublemaker would be coming with Nick away from Hogwarts. Helena had already made her way towards the train by this point, since she was technically sneaking away. Chapter 166, Small Altercation. Most who didn't know what to look for wouldn't notice it, but the castle had signs of age along its walls and corridors. Small things like discoloration, hairline cracks and mold in dark areas that no one ever seems to see. Despite being the caretaker for the castle, Filch actually didn't do much repair or cleaning in the school, and it showed. Nick ran his hand along an old crack in the walls of the castle for a moment in thought. Even with generations of wizards living here, this place still feels the passage of time. He could help but imagine that he too may age like this castle in time, firmly standing but with many minor imperfections. He had made peace with the fact he would stop aging in his prime physically speaking, but his mind would still grow old. What he feared most, however, was something that Celebrimbor warned that elves tended to suffer from, which is time blur, where he would seem to lose vast amounts of time just going through the motions of his daily life. To combat this, Nick planned to remain in contact with the rest of the world and be stimulated by it constantly. This was the entire reason he planned to reveal his immortality to the world eventually in the future, as otherwise it wouldn't be hard for it to be revealed anyways. The castle seemed to wake up as the people within it did so and began to go about their final day here. Nick watched as friends hung out for the last time in a decent amount of time, as students hurried to finish books from the library or to turn them in. Even enemies seemed to avoid conflict between them, knowing that any conflict now was pointless. Nick himself chatted with the portraits that he had gotten to know fairly well in his time in the school. He was surprised when a male ghost approached him, one that was covered in blood and had messy brown hair, old-fashioned noble clothing. "Where has she gone?" the ghost asked, as if knowing that Nick knew this information. Nick coldly stared down the ghost in question, as one, he was being rude, and two, those bloodstains belonged to Helena herself. This ghost was after all none other than the person who killed her, the bloody Baron of Slytherin. Now why would Slytherin house ghost want to know the whereabouts of the Ravenclaw house ghost? Nick asked mockingly. The Baron frowned and stared down at Nick as if judging him, but Nick made sure to stare straight into the ghost's eyes defiantly. "Don't mess with me, boy, or you'll regret it. Tell me where Helena went," the Baron said threateningly. Nick merely laughed and purposefully walked through the ghost to show his lack of regard for its words. The bloody Baron could only watch him leave with gritted teeth and an angry glare before floating off to vent his frustrations on Peeves. Nick had come to accept Helena as family, so he very much did not like the bloody Baron due to the ghost's act of killing her and then himself with that same knife. Helena may not act like she cared about how she died when she spoke of it, but she avoided the Slytherin ghost still to this day because of it. Nick was sorely tempted to use the Nazgul ring on the ghost, but didn't fall into that temptation, as despite the ghost's actions he didn't deserve what the ring would do at him. Nick didn't let the confrontation bother him, however, and continued his tour of the castle without issue. Along the way he saw the twins pranking as many people as they could as if to get their fill while they could, and Nick even noticed Peeves with them. While the twins knew better than to try and prank him, the poltergeist did not and chucked a water balloon at him with a mad cackle. Nick merely smiled and pointed his wand at the balloon. Wingardium Leviosa, he said with a swish and flick, freezing the balloon in mid-air. With an upward flick the balloon reversed and flew straight back into the poltergeist's face and burst, soaking it. Unlike ghosts, a poltergeist like Peeves could both touch physical things but also had a physical body as well, so the water balloon worked no problem. Gah! How dare you do this to me? The jester-looking creature screamed angrily. Wait away, sigh. Nick said while pointing his wand at Peeves, causing a bolt of red energy to appear and strike the poltergeist, making it vanish. This spell merely worked to temporarily banish poltergeists such as Peeves, since as an immortal being it couldn't be destroyed. Chapter 167, Visiting Hagrid. The twins saw this happen but could only lament Peeves' misfortune to target the scariest first year they had ever heard of. This wasn't a joke either, as they had searched for any records of anyone like him in the past but no one even came close. Sure, there had been geniuses like Dumbledore and someone called Thomas Riddle, but no one had been nearly as overwhelming in their first year of school. The twins were surprisingly observant, so they had noticed the ease Nick had with understanding magic on a practical level, as if the magic itself told him its secrets, which wasn't far from the truth. Nick's ability to sense magic was so clear that he could pick up on any piece of magic's rough nature from observing it a single time. After that he merely needed to figure out its inverse to dispel it, or practice to replicate it. This only applied to the nature of the magic but not its inner workings, however, so he still needed to learn just like everyone else, only he has an easier time grasping practical magic applications. Despite not knowing these details, the twins still recognized the talent for what it was. Ignoring that though, Nick still had a sort of charisma about him that made it easy for him to take control of a conversation, and the biggest detail of all in their opinion, his crafting ability. By this point the entire school was aware of the rings he crafted, and many were jealous of those who could afford to have something crafted, such as Malfoy. All of this separate made a genius, but together on a single person created a monstrous existence that the twins wanted on their side at all times. Well, if it isn't our favorite firstie, Fred said, soon to be a second year at that. What do we owe the visit to? More business? George asked curiously while adding to his twin's sentence. Nick merely smiled at the two of them and shook his head. Just taking in the castle, since it'll be the last time in quite a while I'll see it, he said honestly, and the twins nodded in understanding. Oh yes, the home away from home effect it seems to have. Am I right? Fred asked, and Nick nodded. Chin up, mate, you've still got another 6 years before it's goodbye for good, George said reassuringly while patting Nick on the shoulder. I'm not sad or anything like that, merely just stuck thinking about the sheer amount of important events that have happened to me in this castle this year, Nick said with a chuckle. Fred laughed. It's certainly been quite the eventful year indeed, he said with a smile. Nick left the twins to their mischief after that and left the castle itself to head to Hagrid's hut to see the half-giant. Along the way he saw various people walking along the shore of the Black Lake, couples mostly. Nick ignored them however, and instead noticed Hagrid outside his hut with a herd of pale skeletal horse creatures with bat-like wings, thestrals. He was feeding them dead rats and checking them over for injuries when Nick arrived. Hagrid probably wouldn't have even noticed Nick had it not been for the creature dipping their heads in unison towards him. Nick of course returned this bow, but by this point Hagrid had turned to see what had caused this scene. Oh, it's just you, Nick. Never seen em do that before and was wonderin' what had gotten em like that. If it's you though, I'd reckon it'd be pretty normal for you to get the respectful treatment, what with your wand being what it was, Hagrid said with an understanding look. Nick looked at the half-giant in surprise, but the man merely scoffed. Don't look at me like that, my memory's no good for most things, but I never forget a beast fact, he said proudly despite insulting himself to a degree. Nuv about me though. What can I do for you, lad? He asked, changing the subject. I figured it'd be rather rude if I was to leave without saying goodbye, so here I am. These are the thestrals that pull the carriages, I take it? Nick asked curiously. I was just getting them ready for the trip, in fact. Odd you can see em though, since usually only those what have seen death can do it, Hagrid said, only confused but not questioning it too much. Nick though knew that he wasn't an exception, seen it, experienced it, and returned from it in fact. If I said I understood death the best, no one save death itself could argue with me, he thought as he rubbed one of the thestrals' head, feeling the cold rough scaled skin under his fingers. Chapter 168, Train Ride and Ollivander. Despite their terrifying appearance, thestrals were very affectionate creatures, and the one Nick was petting leaned into his touch eagerly. Nick was shooed off by Hagrid shortly after that however, as the thestrals were getting overzealous in obtaining Nick's affections and starting to nip at each other to get his pets to themselves. He didn't mind though since he had accomplished what he had come for. Finally Nick met up with his friends since it was time to head to the carriages before going to the train. They chatted casually about how excited they were to not have homework and other such topics. The Hogwarts Express was primed and ready to go when they got there, and after finding their luggage the group got on the train to find a compartment. Nick joked about how lucky they were that the compartments could comfortably hold exactly 6 people when they picked one out. It was never mentioned in the books, but Nick noticed that the train had been deep cleaned since it was previously used, as the scuff marks on the steps had been removed. Harry, Ron, and Nick had to wait outside the compartment since the girls needed to get changed into their normal clothes. It was the boys' turn after that, with the exception of Nick, who was already in casual clothing. The train ride itself was mostly quiet since they had run out of things to talk about. An interesting thing that Nick had noticed once he had left the dense magical area that was Hogwarts and Hogsmeade was that his magical senses seemed to go into overdrive. He could suddenly sense even the most well-hidden magical energy, which came in the form of a faint aura-like web over his and the others' bodies. So this must be the infamous trace used by the Ministry, he thought, before discreetly creating the magic's counterflow and removing it from himself. Being unable to cast magic freely before the age of 17 was simply unacceptable to him after all. None of the others noticed what he did, and a few hours later the train pulled into the station. "All right everyone, looks like it's time to split up. I'll see you all after summer is over, so stay safe," Nick said as they got off the train, as he tossed each of them a ring of protection. All of them nodded and slipped on the rings before heading towards the people at the station to pick them up. Nick rolled his luggage behind him as he walked towards the old man, holding up a sign that read Nicholas Ravenclaw on it in big bold letters. Obviously this old man was none other than Garrick Ollivander himself, here to pick Nick up. Ollivander smiled widely when he saw Nick approaching him, then his eyes seemed to fall on Steve, who was chilling out on his left shoulder looking around curiously. "Ah, Niffler, what a treat. When I was younger I experimented with Niffler fur to make a wand. It wasn't very powerful and tended to have a mischievous personality that preferred charm work," Ollivander said with a nostalgic smile. "Would you believe me if I told you I found the little guy trying to steal from me originally?" Nick asked with a smile. Ollivander chuckled. "I would be surprised if it was any other introduction. Despite their penchant for thievery, I am told they are quite loyal, so I couldn't think of a better pet," Ollivander said with wide smile. "So how are we doing this, since that wasn't exactly specified in the description?" Nick asked curiously. "We'll be taking a portkey to my shop that I had prepared years ago in case I ever felt the need to return whilst travelling," Ollivander said while taking out an old-looking metal mug from his robes. "If you'll wait a moment, I am expecting someone else. Not to worry, they won't be a bother at all, I promise," Nick said while also reassuring the old man he had nothing to worry about. No sooner than Nick had spoken did a figure float out of the ground nearby before turning corporeal and curtsying, much to Ollivander's surprise. "By Merlin's beard, the Grey Lady herself," the old wandmaker exclaimed softly in shock. "As I said, I promise she won't be much of a bother, since she is simply here to show me to my ancestral home during the summer," Nick said, drawing the old man's attention back to himself. Ollivander merely laughed jovially with a wide grin and happy expression. "I would never complain to host the Grey Lady, since after all she was the house ghost of my own house when I went to Hogwarts. Not that I expect you to remember me, of course," he said to Helena. Chapter 169, Diggs. "I have met several members of your family over the years, so I am not overly familiar, but I believe you excelled in transfiguration," Helena said with some thought. Ollivander looked highly pleased that she seemed to remember him in some regard, but then looked regretful. "I am sorry to say that I don't think the portkey works on ghosts such as yourself, unfortunately," he said, truly regretful. Helena merely smiled and turned corporeal, which practically made Ollivander's eyes pop out from shock. "As you can see, that shouldn't be a problem at all," she said with a giggle at his reaction. It took a moment, but soon enough Ollivander managed to compose himself and smile. "It seems I must congratulate you for returning to the living," he said, genuinely impressed. Helena shook her head softly. "I am still dead, I am afraid, however I can take physical form now, which is close enough in my opinion," she said honestly, and Ollivander seemed to understand and nod in agreement. "Yes, I have been told that being a ghost is a rather miserable existence in that regard. Well, we had best be off, as I don't want to be away from the store overly long," he said, and held out the portkey. Nick stuffed his Steve into his luggage to keep him safe before grabbing the loop alongside Helena and Ollivander, then spoke the activation phrase, which was veritology, and the space warped as they were off. Nick was not the biggest fan of the way portkeys worked, as he felt like he was being pulled through a keyhole without shrinking. This was a horribly nauseating feeling that only his strong constitution stopped him from feeling like his was about to throw up, though he needed a moment to stabilize. Ollivander also looked ill from the spatial movement while Helena turned incorporeal for an instant then back being thus unaffected. Nick took Steve out of the luggage and apologized to him as the poor thing had in fact gotten sick. Nick didn't mind though as he merely waved his wand and disposed of the foul substance. I think I just remembered why I never used this thing before. Ollivander said with a disapproving look at the loop. Yet I think I'll be making a better form of teleportation in the future because that was bloody dreadful. Nick chipped in seriously making the old man chuckle. I will wait for that day eagerly then. He said not putting much stock in Nick's words. Nick on the other hand was being very serious since he found it unacceptable that despite having magic that was the best wizards had come up with for instant teleportation. The room that they had teleported into was also dusty and filled with boxes of wands save for the center that they had landed on. I apologize for the poor condition of the room but I tend to keep the backup wands in this room as you can see. Ollivander said before leading the way out of the room. Nick wasn't surprised to find out that the tiny store on the outside was in fact a rather large building on the inside with 2 bedrooms, a bathroom, a workshop, and 2 storage rooms, one for extra wands and one for materials. The workshop also had 3 tall wide bookshelves filled with tomes on veritology. Ollivander seemed most proud of that as according to him he had personally placed every single book there through his own searching. Both Nick and Helena were impressed as they were both aware that Hogwarts barely had 6 books on the subject and Ollivander had nearly 100 on these shelves alone. The reason for this was that knowledge has always been jealously guarded within particular groups and rarely left them. Wandmakers were one such group that zealously defended their knowledge from wandmakers. That reminds me, but what exactly are you going to be teaching me over the summer break? Nick asked, worried he wouldn't be learning about veritology. Ollivander seemed to understand his concerns and chuckled, no need to worry, you will be learning how to make functioning wands, just know that any knowledge beyond my personal findings and public knowledge is off limits. Can't go giving out my family's secrets, you know. Ollivander said, and Nick sighed in relief. Soon the old man led them to a room with a bed and a nightstand but was barren otherwise. You will be staying here for the time being so feel free to spruce the place up however you like. You will be in charge of your own meals however so do keep track of that. Beyond that however I will teach you to the best of my ability for 4 days a week leaving the rest free for yourself. Ollivander explained seriously before leaving. Chapter 170, First Lesson. Nick wasted no time at all placing his luggage at the foot of the bed and setting up an area in the corner for Steve to put his hoard while they were here. Beyond that though he didn't have any change that he felt like making to the room. Walking out of the room with Helena behind him, Nick quickly found Ollivander in the main store dealing with an Auror who seemed to need his wand repaired. The Auror was a fit middle-aged man with plain features and short black hair with a jagged scar on his cheek. Oh? And who might this young man be, Mr. Ollivander? I thought you lived alone. The Auror asked curiously when he saw Nick walk out. A student from Hogwarts who is going to be apprenticing under me for the summer. Ollivander said, not minding the reveal of him taking on an apprentice, even if only temporary. The Auror looked surprised by the answer. Nonetheless, an apprentice you say? I wasn't even aware that that was an option when I went to Hogwarts. The Auror said honestly. It doesn't get as much publicity as it deserves in my opinion, as it was quite the opportunity being missed. Nick cut in. Both Ollivander and the Auror nodded in agreement, though probably for different reasons. Well, I suppose I should go do something to pass the time while my wand gets fixed. A pleasure to meet you, young man. The Auror said before leaving. Ollivander turned to Nick once the man left. Due to the dangerous nature of their work, I unfortunately tend to get many Aurors in need of repair or replacement for their wands. He explained with a sigh before pointing to the wand on the counter. At first Nick didn't see what was wrong with it as it looked fine, but when Ollivander rolled it over gently, a deep gash much like that made by an animal went along the side of the wand, revealing the red core. This wand, for example, required a brand new housing for the core, as you can see. This is a good opportunity to show you some of the basic techniques for wand making. He said calmly. Speaking of teaching, I will hold lessons on Monday through Thursday as business allows, while Friday through Sunday is for you to do whatever you feel the need to. Ollivander added. He then carefully picked up the wand and motioned for Nick to follow him before walking into the back of the store, more specifically the material storage. When replacing a wooden housing for a wand, it is always best to try and make sure that the wood used is not only the same type but also as close to the original as possible in terms of age. In this case, elm with an age of about 30 years. It's for this reason that I have a thin cut out of the rings of each piece of wood so I can identify the best candidate for the replacement. He explained while pointing at the cutouts in question. Nick also noted that Ollivander also had each wood placed in a specific location to make it easier to find the particular type of wood he needed easier. Walking over to a certain spot, Ollivander pointed at a cutout. Do you know how to tell how old a tree is based on the rings? He asked, and Nick nodded. 1 ring equals 1 year if I remember correctly. He answered, and Ollivander smiled, pleased with the answer. Indeed. So why don't you look over these different pieces of elm and find me the closest to 30 years of age at the time of being cut down? He said, motioning to the neat stacks of wood. Nick stepped forward and carefully looked at each cutout one by one until he found what he was looking for and reached forward to grab a piece of wood from that stack. This wood is 29 years old and should do the trick better than the 31-year-old pieces next to it, Nick said while handing over the wood. Ollivander smiled lightly. And why do you think this younger piece of wood would work better than the older one despite them both being near 30 years old? He asked, looking intrigued. Nick frowned as he didn't actually know, it just was a gut feeling he had as a craftsman. Ollivander saw this, looked and laughed. No need to be troubled by it, lad, your instinct on the matter is correct in this case. The real reason a younger wood is most optimal is due to experience in the wood. A younger tree isn't as set in its ways as an older tree, you see, so it can grow to match the core easier than an older wood that was more set in its ways. He explained calmly. Chapter 171, First Lesson, 2. Nick didn't argue but took out his quill and notebook to copy down this information, as while it wasn't super important, it was pure gold for his organic smithing experiments. He had been troubled by how different pieces of wood always seemed to have different resistances to different enchantments. Sure, he had not actually had a successful case of enchanting a wooden ring beyond the magical grenade he kept in greed, but his experiments showed that like animal parts, wood also had affinities. Ollivander then left the storage room and entered the workshop that was very different than Nick's, as most of the tools within it were meant for woodworking instead of metal. This piece of wood is large enough for me to create 2 housings for wands out of it, so watch carefully, Ollivander said seriously as he approached the workbench and grabbed a draw knife meant to strip away bark from trees. Using the tool, the old man meticulously stripped away the bad parts of the wood's exterior. He then grabbed a small blade with a strange spoon-like look and carefully began to peel off slivers of wood from the center of the wooden block. Soon he had a smooth U-shaped furrow in the center of the block, at which time he grabbed a nearby axe and hammer. Lining the axe in the dead center of that furrow, he hit the back of the axe head with the hammer, splitting the wood in half neatly. He then set aside one half of the wood and grabbed a box planer and got to work removing excess material from the wood. Once it was perfectly sized, he then took sandpaper to it to shape it into a wand shape while smoothing the wood at the same time. Soon there was a wand-shaped object ready on the workbench, at which time Ollivander finally spoke. All of this work is necessary to ensure the minimum amount of my own magic possible enters the wood during the process. If I were to use magic to speed up the process, then the core may reject the wood as it would bear my magical signature, he said seriously. Nick made sure to write down this entire process from his point of view as well as what Ollivander was saying. Next, I'll split the wand housing and write the runes needed to turn it into a wand, which unfortunately I cannot allow you to see due to this specific combination being researched by my family over many years, Ollivander said apologetically. Nick shrugged. I don't mind, since I am not here to steal your family's secrets, but I can watch you split the wood and place the core correct, he asked for confirmation. Ollivander nodded. Yes, those are key parts of the process, so not being about to witness them is not a problem, as the runes will have been hidden by then, he said calmly before splitting the wand with a spell and having Nick leave the room. A few minutes later, Ollivander called Nick back into the room, but no matter how hard he looked, he couldn't see any magical runes despite their presence showing up in his magical senses. My family designed this string of runes to integrate seamlessly into the wood, so there are no actual runes visible if someone were to split the wand again. Now watch closely how I place the core into the housing, as it is the same no matter what you use as a core, the old man said, and Nick watched very closely. Ollivander carefully took the core out of the split old wand, which was a white braid of a few hairs, and placed it into the center of the new wand right down the center before he cancelled the splitting spell he used, causing the wand to fully enclose the hairs. Sparks instantly shot out of the tip, startling Nick, but Ollivander merely chuckled at his reaction. That is merely the wand getting rid of my magical signature that had entered the wand during this time. Perfectly normal, I assure you, he explained, and Nick marveled at it as an inanimate object actively chose to reject someone's magic. This was a huge deal, as it showed that in fact it is common for magical objects to have a form of pseudo-sapience if the craft is advanced enough. Don't go making the mistake of thinking that all wands are like this upon creation, as in fact it is only after finding a master that they become like this, as their master's magic nourishes them and grows alongside them. To this day no one knows why this is, merely that it is, Ollivander explained, correcting Nick before his incorrect thoughts could take root. Chapter 172, Exploring Diagon Alley. Why not just make wands out of metal or some other material if wood is so picky? Nick asked, confused. Ollivander chuckled when he heard this question. When I was a young man, barely out of Hogwarts in fact, I too asked that question and I found the answer. As it turns out, you can in fact make wands out of other materials, but they each had their own problems that wooden wands didn't have. For example, a wand made out of metal could not grow at all after being bound to a wizard, as metal is a stagnant thing normally, he said honestly. Sure, metal is strong and steady, but this very same set of properties is what makes it a terrible choice for a wand. Stone has similar problems, but with the added twist of each type of stone having its own affinities as well. In theory you could use bone as a material without any problems, however from what I have found, wands made of bone are extremely stubborn about who they serve. Ollivander continued speaking about the various problems of making wands out of things other than wood, and Nick absorbed the information while writing it down greedily. Soon Ollivander noticed the time and drew the lesson to a close for the day, but walked over to his collection of books and grabbed 3 from the shelf before handing them to Nick. These books were titled A Veritological Compendium, Wand Crafting for Beginners, and A Guide to Runes and Their Use. Seeing as it's a Friday, I will give you these to study over the next 2 days before quizzing you on the material. Other than that, you are free to pursue whatever you wish in this time," the old man said before leaving for the front of the shop. Nick stored the books in greed and fell into thought about the information he had just learned. If metal and stone truly lack the ability to grow stronger over time as a wand, then how does the growth enchantment of my rings work? Do I break some fundamental rule of magic whenever I enchant something, or is there something no one has noticed missing when it's used to make wands that I have somehow added? He pondered deeply with furrowed brows as the answer seemed to elude him. Nick knew he was talented and that his enchantment method was a bit special, but he very much doubted that he was the only one to notice the problem with why metal made for terrible wands. The Ollivander family had been making and selling wands since 300 BC, which was over 2,000 years, so they had likely tried to discover the ins and outs of the situation and yet had failed somehow. The very thought brought chills to Nick, as it meant that an entire family of wand specialists had failed the very topic he was pondering. Forget it, I'll figure it out later, I have time after all. He eventually gave up and left the shop to go exploring the alley properly, since he didn't get the opportunity previously. It came to no surprise to him that the Diagon alley was far more complicated than it first appeared once you got the chance to actually look it over properly. For example, there wasn't just the big name stores in the alley selling things, as Nick found 6 bookstores besides Flourish and Blots that, while not nearly as busy, did still do business. He checked the books in these stores carefully and found that many of them contained what would be considered ancient section books in Hogwarts. Not many, mind you, but enough that Nick's personal collection grew by nearly 30 new tomes, taking up quite a bit of space in greed. This unfortunately reminded him that he needed to somehow expand the space in the ring, as what he had was no longer enough. The problem, however, came in the form of him not wanting to scrap the current enchantments on the ring to reforge it. As it stood right now, greed's enchantments were still very useful despite being amongst the oldest enchanted pieces Nick had ever made. I suppose a professional enchanter may be able to help in this regard, I hope so anyways, Nick thought as he left the last bookstore. After that he noticed it was getting close to dinner time and started looking for a restaurant to dine in at. He soon found a small place hidden around a corner with a faded sign with lights on inside it: Crumontis Culinary Creations, family owned and operated since 1578, the sign read. Nick's curiosity was piqued, so he walked over to the old wooden door and pulled it open, setting off a bell. Chapter 173, Crumontis Culinary Creations. The door creaked loudly as it opened, but Nick didn't want to judge the place on appearances and entered, curious about what he may find. The lobby was a small area with merely 4 old wooden tables with 4 wooden chairs each and a counter with a cash register on it and a doorway leading to the back of the store. In that doorway an old man with short silver hair, a thin but healthy body and a slightly hunched back wearing a robe walked out. "Welcome. Please sit wherever you like and I'll bring you today's menu," the old man said with a happy expression as he waved his hand and a sheet of paper flew from behind him into it. Nick's eyes bulged out slightly at this, as the man hadn't used a wand for that, nor did he recite a spell. For anyone not aware, this was not a big deal, as literally all wizards used magic, but Nick was aware that wandless silent magic was not part of what the general public was capable of casually doing. Nick knew for a fact that even people like Dumbledore struggled to use the stuff, and yet this particular old man had done so casually. "I was merely interested in seeing what this place was about before, but I never would have expected this," he thought as he sat himself down at a table near the window. The old man walked casually to the table and placed the menu on the table in front of Nick. "While waiting for your food, is there any particular beverage I can interest you in from the list there?" the old man asked while pointing out the list on the paper. Nick looked over the list and was surprised to see that it wasn't the usual selection of British drinks but included things from all over the world. "I'd like a cup of kisher if it's not much trouble." Nick said, seeing that on the list alongside a description of the drink. The old man smiled widely. An excellent choice. Please look over the menu as I get it prepared, he said before walking back into the doorway at the back of the store. The description said that Kishore was an infusion made with coffee husks, ginger, sugar and cinnamon, served hot and sweetened. Nick had never even heard of the drink before, but it sounded fantastic and as a result wanted to try it. Looking over the food portion of the menu, he was surprised to find that besides a single British dish, the rest were all from somewhere else. There was Thai green curry, ropa vieja, bobatai and a few more dishes that Nick didn't know. They had descriptions, however, much like the drinks that made choosing easier. Nick personally decided on the bobatai, that was apparently a casserole-type dish made with spiced lamb mince, dried fruits and an egg-based crust on top garnished with bay leaves. Once again Nick had no clue if this was a good idea, but the dish sounded great for dinner. After about 10 minutes the old man returned with a pitcher of steaming orange tea-looking liquid and a glass. Setting the glass on the table, he poured in the liquid from the pitcher before setting the pitcher down on the table. I take it you have decided on a dish? He then asked with an expectant look. I apologize if I butcher the name, but this dish here, bobatai, was the choice I had made, Nick said while pointing at the dish on the paper. The old man nodded with a pleased look. This dish should pair wonderfully with the kishore. Give me a while to get it made and I'll have it right out, he said before taking the menu and heading back to behind the doorway. As the beverage was hot, Nick carefully sipped on it and was quite pleased to discover that it was a wonderful mix of sweet, spicy, and earthy. Another 10 minutes later and the old man returned, though empty-handed this time. Forgive me if I seem like I am prying, but can you tell me what made you come here of all places today for food? He asked curiously. Nick shrugged. Not much to pry into, as I saw it was near dinner time and happened to notice your restaurant and decided to give it a try. So far I am quite pleased by this spur-of-the-moment decision of mine, he said honestly with a smile as he sipped his drink again. The old man chuckled. Sometimes a random act means all the difference, the old man said mysteriously before leaving once again. Chapter 174, Hidden Conversation. Nick received his food 20 minutes later and had spent the time waiting reading a veritological compendium. The topic of the book was about the types of wood or cores usable in the craft, as well as the personal findings of the author in regards to them. The author in this particular case was none other than Ollivander himself, and as such his personal findings were quite precious. Despite this, however, the information was short and digestible, making it easy to memorize. Nick knew that this was likely done on purpose, since this book was clearly a teaching aid. After paying the 5 sickles for the food and leaving with a promise to return, the old man once again walked back through the doorframe at the back of the store. If Nick was here, he would have been horrified by what he saw in the back of the store. There were 3 rooms here, with one being a well-maintained kitchen, the other a storage room for ingredients, and the final one being the one that would make his blood run cold. This room was a fairly cozy bedroom with a single man sitting in a chair, seemingly waiting for something. This man looked identical to the old man who had just walked in, down to even the clothes. The reason Nick would have been horrified at this scene was that the old man who had walked into the room suddenly had his features shift and change as he grew taller and much younger as well. Soon the old man turned into a lithe man with white hair and 2 different colored eyes, one Gellert Grindelwald with a small smile. The old man in the chair saw this and smiled himself. I take it the customer interested you, Monsieur Grindelwald, he said with a heavy French accent. Indeed. Despite being a seer, I had never seen that this would be how I would meet him, Grindelwald said honestly. If it is not too presumptuous of me, might I inquire who it was to surprise you so greatly? The old man in the chair asked. Grindelwald merely shook his head gently. Not at all, old friend, it was a young man that I became aware of not long ago by the name of Nicholas Ravenclaw, the Dark Lord said honestly, causing the old man's eyes to widen as he heard those words. Truly? You tried to convince him to join our cause, Key? The old man asked, slipping into French at the end. Grindelwald shook his head and chuckled. There was no need, since he is already at the core of our movement, even if he doesn't realize it yet, the Dark Lord said, confusing the old man. Enough about the boy. What is the status of the previous mission I sent the others on? Grindelwald asked, changing the subject. Macmillan and the others have placed the 6th ritual circle covertly and are waiting for the roaming aurors to leave before placing any more, the old man said seriously. Meanwhile, Nick was walking back to the wand shop with a full belly and no idea at all that he had been mere feet away from Grindelwald, as his magical senses couldn't pick up the man at all. As far as they were concerned, the old man he was talking to was merely an above-average wizard in terms of magical energy. The reason for this had to do with the fact that Grindelwald, unlike Dumbledore, was hiding at the moment and as a result wore special enchanted hag's tones that suppressed his magic to normal levels. As a result of Hagstone's innate magical restriction abilities, Nick couldn't sense these things as his magical senses were in fact magical in nature. This meant that unless he knew Grindelwald's magical signature he wouldn't be able to tell that it was him at all. Once back at the shop, Nick went straight to his room in order to pick up where he left off in the book. He also made sure to copy down the information as he went with a basic copying charm on his quill that copied what he read. He bought a few blank books specifically for this purpose since he had no plans of robbing the books from Ollivander. Nick learned the properties of each type of wood along with their appearance, the best way to identify magical trees compared to non-magical ones, and even which woods are least favored by wand makers and why. He stayed up until 9 p.m. reading and memorizing this information before he finally called it finished after rereading it no less than 3 times. The copy he made was stored away the same as the original and he went to sleep happy with his new knowledge. Chapter 175, Theodore Tonks. The next morning at dawn, Nick woke up and got dressed before heading out of the store after wishing Ollivander a good morning. As it turned out, the old wand maker was even more of an early bird than Nick, as he was already up and about by the time Nick woke up. Today I need to track down that lawyer, and the best way I can think to do so is via the ministry, he thought as he walked past Gringotts and towards the large building in the distance that was already bustling with activity despite how early it is. Nick soon arrived at the British Magical Ministry and entered the doors leading to the atrium while marvelling at the place. Unlike during the Yule Ball, the atrium was in its usual orientation with multiple floors active and wizards in suits hurrying to and fro across the hard marble floors. Thankfully the ministry had signs giving directions to all the relevant departments, so Nick made his way to communications without much issue. There he approached one of the tellers at a desk with a friendly smile. "Excuse me, but I was wondering if you might be able to help me?" he asked calmly. The teller, who was a plain-looking skinny brown-haired woman, looked up from her paperwork and blinked a few times from surprise. "Where are your parents at? Do they know you are here?" she asked, not expecting that a child such as himself had came here on his own. Nick didn't blame her, as his body was in fact only 12 and had only just reached that age on March 2nd, which is to say the day after Beltane. He flashed his lord ring at the woman. "I have no parents and have come in regards to a piece of business of mine," he said as the woman went pale at the sight of the ring. Not long ago Minister Fudge had told everyone to keep an eye out for a boy with this signet ring as an important person. "I am sorry for the misunderstanding, sir. What can I help you with?" the teller said, switching to a business-like tone in no time at all. Nick waved off her apology. "I need to get in contact with a person but don't know their full name," he explained calmly, and the teller had an understanding look. "Can I get a name and occupation if you have it?" she asked, and Nick gave her the information, which she typed into an old-school typewriter before hitting enter. Soon the paper folded itself and flew off as a paper airplane. "It usually takes a few minutes," the teller said, and Nick nodded and waited patiently. 5 minutes later another paper airplane flew over to the desk and landed gently in front of the woman. She unfolded it and looked it over before nodding and handing it over to Nick. On the paper was the name Theodore Ryan Tonks alongside an address and place of employment. Nick nodded at the information before storing the paper away. "Thank you for your help, please have a good day," he said, leaving a galleon on the desk and walking away. As luck would have it, the residence listed on the paper was located in Diagon Alley, not far away. The fact that Diagon Alley was not just a place with stores but also living places was not a very well-known fact amongst Muggleborns until after they graduated normally, since the shopping area was all they ever saw while in school. Nick eventually made it to the address listed on the paper and calmly walked up to the door, which had a large metal knocker, and knocked on the door. A few minutes later a tall, healthy, blonde-haired man answered the door with a confused expression as he looked at Nick. "Theodore Tonks, I take it?" Nick asked, and the man nodded. "I have come to you in regards to the unlawful imprisonment of your extended family in Azkaban," Nick said bluntly. Ted's face changed immediately to one of sternness. "Which member and unlawful how?" he said, fully serious. Nick merely smiled and gestured to the surroundings. "Might I come in to discuss it further in a more private setting?" he said, and Ted nodded before pulling the door open all the way. Nick calmly walked into the house and wiped his shoes on the doormat carefully. The house was a small but cozy place with 2 floors and an open dining area that had 2 women, including one with bubblegum pink hair, looking at Nick in confusion at the table. "Now, explain yourself, stranger," Ted said, brokering no argument. Chapter 176, Making Arrangements. "Ted, what's going on?" the 30-year-old looking brunette woman at the table asked, worried after seeing how hostile her husband seemed. Nick looked at this woman with a smile and politely dipped his head in greeting. "You must be Andromeda then. A pleasure to make your acquaintance. I am Nicholas Ravenclaw and I came here to speak with your husband in regards to the unlawful imprisonment of your cousin Sirius Black." Nick said, and the eyes of all three of the house's residents widened in shock. Ted did not like having been so easily dismissed by Nick, but knew better than to allow himself to get angry over such a small thing. Unlawful how? Sirius's sins were plain to see. Andromeda said with a stern expression. Nick didn't mind the hostility as he was aware that this news was of the faith-shattering sort. Still smiling, Nick answered, I assume then that you are unaware that not only is there not a shred of evidence against Sirius, but in fact that he was also imprisoned without a trial as well. He said once again, leaving both Andromeda and Ted shocked once again. That's impossible. The Ministry would never allow such a thing. Ted said in an attempt to refute Nick, but Nick merely snorted disdainfully at it. As someone who works closely with the Ministry, you of all people should be aware of the rampant corruption throughout it. Unfortunately for you, however, everything I have said can be easily verified. There is no record of a trial because there simply was no trial. The victim of the crime, Peter Pettigrew, is also very much alive and healthy to this day as well. He said, shattering the entire family's former knowledge of the situation. The house was entirely silent for a few moments as the family wrapped their heads around what Nick had said. If, and I do mean if, what you say is true, what does it have to do with you? Ted finally asked skeptically. Nick's smile widened. An excellent question. If you mean myself personally, then not a damn thing. However, if you include those amongst my close friends, then quite a bit. You see, not only has Peter Pettigrew been living with my friend Ronald Weasley's family since that time, but my best friend Harry could really use the support the Sirius could provide him. Nick explained honestly. Both Ted and Andromeda paused for a moment to take in this new information, but the bubblegum-haired girl who Nick guessed was Nymphadora blurted out a question. Wait, if Peter Pettigrew was living with the Weasleys this whole time, how come no one has known about it? She asked, confused. Both Ted and Andromeda also realized this irregularity and looked at Nick in such a way that demanded answers. Nick had come here prepared for this. However, quick question, as a metamorphagus, I take it you are well familiar with all forms of transfiguration, yes? He asked, confusing her greatly. But she was clever enough to realize this was related to her own question as well. I am very familiar with the subject. What of it? She asked curiously. Nick nodded, satisfied with her answer. When you transfigure a human, is their lifespan affected at all? He asked, and Nymphadora, still confused, shook her head. Not at all. She answered confidently. Final question before the big reveal. What is the average lifespan for a common English rat? Nick asked and watched in satisfaction as the clever girl pieced together the puzzle he had laid out. He's the Weasley's rat. She exclaimed once she figured out the only logical conclusion of all the information they had been given. What do you mean, NYM? Andromeda asked, not understanding why her daughter had said such a thing. Nymphadora explained how the Weasleys have this rat named Scabbers that has been a family pet for the last 10 or so years. She also explained how a normal English rat only has a lifespan of about 5 years, and the Weasleys had the rat as an adult this entire time, which is impossible except for a single exception. It was actually a transfigured human. Yes, I recently discovered that James Potter, Peter Pettigrew, and Sirius Black are all illegal animagi, with Peter Pettigrew's animal form being none other than a common rat. As it just so happens, the unnaturally long-lived rodent living with the Weasleys is also missing the digit that Peter Pettigrew lost on that fateful night a decade ago. Nick explained seriously, and the entire family looked horrified. Poor Sirius has been rotting in Azkaban for a crime he didn't commit this entire time. Andromeda said, teary-eyed, which was all Ted needed to see to decide to try and help Nick free Sirius. Chapter 177, Making Arrangements, 2. Do you have a plan? Ted asked Nick seriously. First, we need to get a hold of Peter Pettigrew. Second, we need to go to the head of the DMLE Amelia Bones with the rat and present our case. Finally, I need to personally talk Fudge out of trying any funny business in order to try and preserve the Ministry's reputation. If we act without doing so, then he may cause Peter to vanish mysteriously while in custody, or even go so far as to have the Dementors share a kiss with Sirius under the guise of them going out of control. Nick said with a dark expression. That's horrible. Nymphadora exclaimed in horror. Nick sighed. There's no such thing as a pure-hearted politician. If it benefits them even a little, there is very little such people wouldn't do. Ask your mother if you don't believe me. She comes from a family famous for that exact same thing. He said honestly, and Nymphadora looked at her mother, who only nodded with an ashamed look. How do you plan to catch Pettigrew if he has been hiding for so long in plain sight? Andromeda asked seriously. Nick grinned. That it where I come handy. You see, I just so happen to be able to forge a ring that will force the rat into his human form so long as it is on his person. I can use the excuse of visiting my friends to spring this trap. However, as an extra precaution, I need you to get in contact with Alastair Moody so he can be present as well to ensure nothing untoward happens. He explained, and after serious thought they all agreed to this plan of action. Nick told them that he was staying with Ollivander and to contact him if they needed anything before leaving their house. It was still fairly early in the day, so Nick decided to get the animagus trap ring done now so that it is ready when he needed it. As a result, he went back to Ollivander's and asked to borrow the workshop temporarily to forge the ring. The old man was fine with that but asked Nick to clean up any mess he made after he was done. Once in the workshop, Nick locked the door and pulled his anvil and tools from Greed alongside a pre-made ring of iron. Nick had been keeping pre-made iron rings recently since they were the base of his ring of protection business. Setting the ring on the anvil, Nick began to channel his spiritual energy, causing a gold and white glow to radiate from him before concentrating on his hand. The energy was firm and steady, which showed how good at channeling his energy Nick was becoming, but he was still a long way from not glowing at all when he forged. Raising his hammer, he spoke "Ler. Man," and struck the ring, making a glowing word appear next to it. "Allah. Deny," he said, and struck once again, causing yet another word to appear in the air. "Nasto. Beast." He struck once again, causing the third word to appear, and he felt that it needed one more word to complete. After a brief second of contemplation, he found the perfect word to sum it all up and struck Retta. To catch in a net or entrap. The ring hummed in an almost hypnotic way as he poured his knowledge and intention into the ring with each word until he was done and the ring was finished. Ring name, N/A. Grade, Rare. Abilities, Autozizing, Anti-Animagi, Bound, Weakening. Description: a ring forged with the intent to capture an animagus while forcing them to stay in their human forms. System: appraisal, a purposeful ring that was created by an up-and-coming ringsmith. He did not name the ring because he did not think it needed one, and so the appraisal was listed like this. It didn't bother him at all, and the system also didn't care about it as he still got 32 points for creating it. That done, Nick marveled how he wasn't totally drained by the forging attempt this time and knew it was because of his more abundant energy pool and stronger soul. It seems that digesting soul shards also improves my forging stamina, noted he thought seriously while storing his stuff again and unlocking the door to the workshop. He was slightly surprised to see Ollivander standing nearby with a curious expression on his face, but the old man didn't actually ask any questions. Nick could tell that this was the old man's way of respecting his secrets as a fellow craftsman, and went to his room with a wordless nod of acknowledgement. In the room, Nick was greeted by the sight of Helena pampering Steve with back scratches and food. A fun fact about Nifflers was that since they used the pouch on their stomachs to store their loot until it can be deposited in their hoards, they don't like it when people touch their bellies. Chapter 178, Gift for Runes. I have set my plan into motion and merely need to wait for the Tonks to contact me for a meeting with Alastair Moody. A man such as him wouldn't be willing to act on faith alone for something like this after all. Nick said, and Helena nodded. I've seen the man visit Dumbledore at the school, and calling him paranoid is an understatement. He double-checks everything he touches and seems to distrust every word spoken to him until verified. I have known a scarce few individuals over my long life as a ghost who were so cautious to the point I need but one hand to list them. Helena says, agreeing with Nick's description of the man. Yes, Alastair Moody is a paranoid individual, but there is not a single person who I would trust more not to stab me in the back. My only concern is that he will report this movement to Dumbledore, who may intervene to prevent Sirius's release. Nick said seriously. Helena frowned at this, as it was very much a real possibility. Is it possible Dumbledore may in fact help your cause in this case as well? She asked, trying to play the devil's advocate. Nick thought about it for a few minutes as his mind raced with the various ways that the old goat could use this to his advantage. As much as he disliked the idea, Nick could only admit that the possibility of the old goat helping was greater than him hindering, as a free Sirius benefited him greatly. Not only would Sirius hold a seat on the Wizengamot, but he would also likely funnel the Black Fortune into the light faction that has Dumbledore at its head. Even more so would be that he could use this as an avenue to getting into Harry's good graces. Nick sighed. It is actually probable that that would happen if he chose to involve himself at all rather than take a hands-off approach to it. He said honestly. If that is so, then why does the idea displease you? Helena asked, slightly confused. Because we don't need his help to succeed, and he will know this if he is even half as clever as I think. So any aid he provides will likely be done knowing he benefits from the outcome. He explained with a headache. For now though, I will be studying the tomes Ollivander has given me for the rest of the day unless something happens. Nick said, taking his shoes off and sitting with his back against the pillow of the bed while removing the books in question from Greed. All of them except the one on the materials that he had already memorized, that is. The first book he grabbed to start was Wand Crafting for Beginners, that didn't have an author listed. The first excerpt of the book however had him close it and pick up the second book, A Guide to Runes and Their Use. If you are reading this book without knowledge of runes and their power, you will not make much progress, as while not strictly needed, the runes used in crafting wands help the process immensely. Nick chuckled as he thought about how early he was diving into runes compared to his fellow second-year students. Most of them didn't have the option to learn the subject until the third year and beyond, where it was an elective. While a year head start doesn't seem that great in the grand scheme of things, it should be noted he also worked on the second-year curriculum during the year, so he was actually now 2 years ahead of his classmates. Being ahead of his peers had given Nick lots of benefits in terms of free time that would otherwise be needed to study the year's work. Granted, he used that time mostly to study other topics, but he still had the free time that his peers could only look at jealously. Eating a bit of Lemba's bread to satisfy his hunger, Nick cracked open the runes book only to have to hold back a laugh. The reason for this is that he found that his magical ability to read and speak any language applied to the runes as well. What this meant was that unlike everyone else who needed to struggle with learning what the runes meant at any given moment as well as trying to figure out how to layer them in sentences, he merely needed to get good at drawing the things to succeed in it. No wonder Helena was so jealous of me when she learned of it. It's basically a perfect ability for enchanting. I merely need to learn the runic alphabet to be able to string together massive complex enchantments by writing them out, he thought with a grin. Chapter 179, Mad-Eye. If that was not enough of a boon, he also could read, write, and speak Elvish, that was a magical language like these runes as well. This meant not only could he learn to write standard runes fluently, but he also had a runic language exclusively to himself at the moment. No one else in the world had the language save perhaps the few snippets engraved into his rings that translating may as well be impossible with such a small example size. Sure, someone could write the words over and over before sending magic through them to figure out a set ability of each word, but the full potential of the language was his exclusively. Knowing all this, Nick focused his mind to learning the runic alphabet provided in this book, which was Elder Futhark in this case. The symbols were headache-inducingly strange to look at for any real period of time, much less the entire hour Nick spent staring at them. He of course didn't just look at the alphabet this entire time, but also read the uses that the book said they had, most of which he knew already. It was common stuff like how engraving the runes correctly could produce enchantments or wards. There was even a section that talked about how getting runic phrases tattooed allowed for wandless casting of whatever effect they held. The part that really caught Nick's attention, however, was that runes were used in veritology in order to amplify the ability to focus a wizard's magical energy for more efficient spell casting. There were many different rune combinations for wands, but the most used according to the book are the words power, focus and spirit. So that's why wands seem to affect souls with their bond. Nick thought, interested in the idea. The use of runes in rituals was also stated, but the author seemed to disdain the topic as they barely covered it. Nick could only shrug at this, since everyone had their own biases and he was in no place to judge in this regard, as most known rituals tended to be dark things as far as the world was concerned. To someone so obviously enthusiastic about runes, seeing them used in such a manner likely left them with a foul mood. Nick himself would be quite upset to see someone using one of his works used in a dark manner like that as well. Unfortunately, Nick didn't get to go much further into the book as Ollivander showed up at the doorway with a curious expression. "You have a visitor in the lobby, a most curious one at that," he said, and Nick looked confused but got up and put his shoes on nonetheless. Walking out into the lobby of the wand shop, he saw a gnarled-looking man with thin wiry grey hair, a face covered in scars, and a peg leg, while one of his eyes was an enchanted thing that flitted about the room constantly looking for danger. "Alastair Moody. They certainly move fast, don't they? I assume you are here in regards to a certain rat, correct?" Nick asked with an amused expression. Moody's enchanted eye flicked its gaze between each of the places Nick held an enchanted item before focusing on Nick himself in a scrutinizing manner. "Constant vigilance, I believe it was," Nick said while motioning towards the various protective artifacts on his person. Moody seemed to appreciate the humor of the situation as he relaxed ever so slightly. "Quite so. As for your question, I am indeed here about this rodent problem of ours," Moody said gruffly while catching on immediately to not share any details with Ollivander. It wasn't that Nick didn't trust the old man, but rather that he simply had nothing to do with the matter and Nick didn't want to implicate him. "Looks like I'm heading out again, Mr. Ollivander," Nick told the old man, who nodded and wished him off. Once out of the store, Moody roughly grabbed a hold of Nick and operated away. Nick shook his head and stumbled about from the violent method of transportation once he hit the ground again. Looking around, he could see that they were in the middle of field with short-cut grass for as far as the eye could see. "Couldn't risk anyone overhearing us in that place. Now speak up, boy, tell me how you learned about the illegal animagus status of Black and his friends," Moody barked out gruffly. Nick took a moment to settle his stomach before he spoke. They were rather arrogant while in school and left behind clues for those who could find them. Such as the names used in the artifact known as the Marauder's Map, Mooney, Padfoot, Prongs and Wormtail. He explained calmly. Chapter 180, Mad-Eye, 2. Moody searched Nick for any signs of deception, but upon finding none he nodded in acceptance and asked another question. How did you discover Pettigrew as well as how Black hadn't gotten a trial? Nick chuckled. As you can see, I am a rather careful person normally, so after learning about my best mate's family situation I did some digging into the laws and paperwork of the whole event and found some interesting things. Did you know that legally speaking a lord cannot be imprisoned in Azkaban as the family magic reacts to the official judgments and removes that person from their position? He grinned widely after saying this. Care to take a guess at who holds the current Black Lordship? Nick asked with a chuckle. Could have been an error in magic. Moody said as if to debunk the implication, but he clearly showed that he understood where this topic was going. I too had thought the same thing, but after digging around a bit in the papers I found that there was no mention of the man ever getting a trial. Curious how despite how much publicity this got, such a thing didn't get mentioned at all, isn't it? So I pulled on that thread and learned that Sirius Black was captured and directly shipped to Azkaban without any trial or confession at all. It was at that point I started to look into the man's past and discovered the animagus status of most of the group as well as Pettigrew himself so very close by. Nick said with a look of disgust while saying that last part. This wasn't faked either, as since he had been in the family for so long in rat form none of the Weasleys had minded their privacy around the rat. If you said the Pettigrew hadn't most likely spied on the family's most intimate moments, then Nick would call you a liar. Even worse is that this included the prepubescent Ginny as well. That made it even more disgusting to think about. Moody himself understood where Nick's disgust came from and was wholeheartedly in agreement with him. Why did you say most of the group instead of all of it? Moody asked after noticing the inconsistency. Nick shrugged. Remus Lupin, need I say more? He said, and Moody shook his head since he knew what Nick was referring to. What of Dumbledore HMM? Why did you not bring this to his attention if you knew? Moody asked, as this in his opinion was the most suspicious part. Nick scoffed. You should be abundantly clear on my opinion of the man if you did your research, as I know you did. He said with an irritated expression. That is irrelevant to the situation, and he was the easiest way to see Black free. So why didn't you go to him? Moody reiterated, not backing down from his pursuit of the truth. Nick glared at the man intensely for a moment, which made the veteran slightly nervous somehow. The man has shown himself an ill-advised choice for such a matter in my own experience, and so I decided to do this on my own without him. Don't ask again, I don't like repeating myself. Nick said firmly, dropping the subject. Moody was a very experienced man and knew better than to antagonize someone needlessly, especially when that person looked almost as paranoid about their safety as himself. His eye had revealed no less than 9 protective items on Nick, with one of them making his instincts scream danger on the boy's ankle. Moody knew better than to assume that such a person wouldn't also have taken offensive measures if pressed far enough. Clearly he had started to tap that bottom line with his badgering and wisely chose to allow the topic to end here. Fine, explain your plan in as much detail as possible. He said gruffly, and Nick did so. It's a good plan, as he covered all of his bases and even took care of unforeseen incidents by including myself to fill in the parts he might have missed due to his inexperience. Moody analyzed seriously. He'd make a good Auror with such a mind so long as he got the right guidance, he thought before speaking again. I will be bringing Dumbledore into this, as it's too big for the few of us alone. He said gruffly. Nick frowned and made intense eye contact. If he messes this up in any way, I expect you to take responsibility for involving him. He said, and Moody nodded. I can agree to this, so this is how we will do this. The man said, and started adding details to the plan that Nick hadn't thought of but were very good. Chapter 181, To Catch a Rat. Nick was taken back to the wand shop after the details were settled on the plan, and Moody left to prepare for his part as well as to inform Dumbledore. Nick had a week to finish his own preparations, as Moody made it clear that they needed to get this done as soon as possible to prevent any unknown variables. This meant that Nick needed to be done and ready to go by next Saturday, which was fine in his opinion, as he merely needed to do a couple extra things that he could finish early tomorrow. Meanwhile, while Nick was back at the wand shop finishing up his day, Moody had already contacted Dumbledore for a meeting and was in the man's office at this moment. Dumbledore had a serious expression after listening to Moody explaining the situation. So despite my high opinion of the boy, I have still fallen short, it seems. He said with a tired sigh as he slouched in his chair. To think such a young man would piece together such scattered fragments to this decade-old puzzle and break it wide open is astounding. He added, ashamed of not having pieced the puzzle together himself out of willful ignorance of the subject. Dumbledore knew well that he could have easily figured out the same things as Nick had he not totally decided in his mind that the matter was at its end already and thus hadn't cared enough to see the problems. It was a downside of his advanced age as he could sometimes see far ahead and other times not even the next day's events. He was not demented as such a thing was nearly impossible in wizards but his mind simply wasn't capable of the same constant focus as when he was younger. I think it would be best if we got Remus involved in this as they were both his friends and he will want to be included. Dumbledore spoke softly but with authority and Moody nodded. Best contact Arthur privately so that he can keep an eye on Pettigrew this next week as well so the rat doesn't sniff out the trap. Moody said gruffly and Dumbledore agreed. Tread carefully around the boy Albus, he seems to have quite the negative opinion of you at the moment as he looked ready to turn violent when I pressed him about not coming to you himself. Moody said seriously. Dumbledore sighed. I am aware of his vision of me and have tried to stay hands off despite the many concerning moves he's made both in secret and openly. He said tiredly. Moody looked stern. What's the boy done to worry you? He asked seriously. He has done something to anger Voldemort on the night Harry banished his spirit from the castle. He placed himself in a perfectly neutral position within the school's houses with his actions and somehow convinced a ghost to leave Hogwarts with him over the summer, one with a great deal of lost or forgotten knowledge. Dumbledore explained. The concerning part however is that no one seems to know exactly why he's done all of this and his mind is hidden from us as well thanks to his own protective measures. The old man said with a deep expression. The meeting ended shortly after that as they both had preparation to make for the trap and subsequent steps. The next day Nick woke up nice and early with a loud yawn and stretched. After getting changed he left the shop again and this time headed down the street to the Ollery to send a message to Ron and Harry informing them of his plan to visit next Saturday. The birds were all eager to send a message for him but a small pygmy owl got the privilege due to being bolder than the rest and snatching the letter out of Nick's hand and flying off. He got a good laugh out of the situation as the other birds looked shocked at how bold the small bird was. Honestly Nick hated sending messages by owl as he always had to disappoint a bunch of them when he chose one to deliver it so him not needing to choose worked just fine for him. The rest of the day he spent practicing drawing the runes with an engraving pen he bought from the system for 100 points. He also used a transfigured bar of iron in the shape of a plate as his canvas and reverted it back to normal and then back again into a plate when he needed more space to write. He found that drawing runes was a time-consuming process for him as they were quite complex in design and if he got the depth wrong it ruined them entirely. Chapter 182, Movements. Nick had made decent progress with his ability to inscribe runes onto the metal but he could tell that he was still a novice as not only did he still constantly make mistakes he also could only carve the runes fairly large rather than the tiny way used for normal enchanting. Sure he could technically use runes of any size for enchanting but the mark of a decent enchanter in this world was the ability to inscribe them neatly on any object at least the size of a ring. It's fine since I have plenty of time to get good at it, he thought as he left the wand shop around dinner time to get some food. He decided to go back to Crumonta's place for food as the food there was exotic and interesting at the very least. The old man welcomed him back with a smile and handed over a menu as if he had expected Nick to show up. He probably did with how good the food was last time I was here. Nick thought with a chuckle and picked out his drink and dish for the evening, salt-baked chicken and pear cider. Just like his previous visit the food was wonderful and he was happy to pay the rather high price that was asked for the food at 7 sickles 3 nuts this time. The old man asked if Nick had been any interesting tales to share while stating that he loved to listen to them from his customers. So for the next hour while he waited for his food and ate Nick talked about the events of last year where he had all sorts of ups and downs. There was something about the elderly that made one want to vent to them about their problems and Nick was no different. The old man listened on with a smile and an interested look and even laughed, scowled, and gave advice at certain parts of Nick's narration. Obviously Nick didn't go talking about the deeply private, illegal, or secretive things that happened but mainly about the publicly known ones with a few personal details added in. He complained about Dumbledore's actions and the hidden Dark Lord that was the Dada teacher. He talked about the plans his friends made thinking it was Snape after the treasure in the castle and the baby dragon as well as thieving Steve. After paying for his food Nick left in a good mood after having spoken about his tumultuous year while thanking the old man for listening. He was completely unaware that he had basically just fed Grindelwald an insider's point of view of the entire last year's events pretty much. What a fascinating story, it seems that age is starting to catch up with you old friend. Grindelwald thought in amusement before closing the restaurant for the night since it seemed no one else was coming. The actual owner of the shop was meanwhile relaxing while his house elf cleaned up the mess from cooking the food. Nick turned in for the night content and eager for the lesson from Ollivander the next day. Waking up bright and early Nick ate a bit of Lemba's bread before heading out into the lobby of the store to find Ollivander. The old man was chatting with Helena about the wand-making practices of her time, as much had been lost in the last 1,000 years. She was answering him too, which was rather unlike her, as towards most people she was quiet and distant. Helena pointed out that Nick was up, and the old wand-maker greeted him with a smile. "I assume you have reviewed the tome I provided to at least some degree?" he asked casually. Nick nodded and retrieved the books from Greed. "I memorized their contents already and even copied them down into some blank books I have." "I hope that's not a problem?" he asked, worried that Ollivander disapproved of his copying. The old man merely shook his head at Nick's concern. "Though if I didn't plan to share the knowledge I wouldn't have given you the books to begin with," he said honestly. Meanwhile, Arthur Weasley was not having a good day after visiting Dumbledore under the man's request. From this visit he had learned that the beloved family pet Scabbers was actually the animagus form of Peter Pettigrew this entire time, and that he needed to keep an eye on the man without letting his family find out. To say that his blood was boiling in rage at the many implications that this information held would be a lie, but he was a lawmaker for the ministry and knew how to contain his rage for the most part. Chapter 183, Veritology Lessons. Arthur was almost caught by his wife due to the slight angry tics he had, but convinced her that it was just a particularly nasty case at work. Molly Weasley was skeptical of this, but trusted her husband to know what was good for his family, and thus didn't mention it again, though she noticed that he seemed to be watching their youngest son Ron closer than usual. Other than that, nothing was all that different at the Burrow, save perhaps the antics the boys got up to with Harry living here for the next 2 months of summer break. Nick meanwhile was being tested on the information within the books by Ollivander back at the wand shop. "And what is this wood?" the old man asked while pulling out an unworked piece of wood from his storage. "Pine," Nick said after looking at the wood carefully. "And this rune word?" the old man asked, showing a written word on a sheet of paper. "Bind," Nick answered easily. Ollivander nodded with a smile. "Very good, it seems you truly did memorize the information in those books. That knowledge will make my job much easier in the long run," he said honestly. "My goal is that by the end of the summer break you will be able to craft a functioning wand from start to finish. In that spirit, the first step I am going to teach you is wood tapping," Ollivander said calmly as he led Nick back to the workshop area. Nick was surprised to see a tall pile of woods of various types stacked against the wall, but he also noticed that they were not of the magical sort but the non-magical versions of the same types of wood that were likely going to be his practice pieces. Ollivander soon confirmed exactly that every wand maker worth anything is capable of taking a piece of wood and finding the most optimal parts to be crafted into a wand or wands if one is lucky. This process is known as wood tapping and is a crucial step to make sure the wand created is stable throughout it. He paused to grab a piece of oak from the top of the pile. "Take this piece for example, how many wands does it look like it could make just based on its size?" the old man asked while handing the wood over to Nick. "Just based on material 3 or 4 easily, but I assume the actual number is different, right?" Nick said while handing the piece back. Ollivander nodded his head with a pleased expression. "Yes, in fact this piece of wood can only make a single wand, though of poor quality due to the unmagical nature of it, as you have likely noticed. The part capable of being turned into a wand is discoverable by looking at the grain and cracks in the wood," Ollivander said before pointing out various tiny details Nick never would have known to look for in any other situation. Ollivander made him repeat this information back so that he could make sure Nick learned it right, which also allowed him to correct a few mistakes Nick made in the process. That was how Nick spent the next 6 hours before Ollivander was satisfied with the information he had crammed into Nick's head. The student in question, however, had a massive migraine from the sheer amount of details that went into this single part of the crafting process alone. Nick knew that if he wrote this information down it would fill 2 decent-sized books easily. Nick went and got food from Crew Montes before turning in mentally exhausted from the information he had received. He knew that the subject was deep and very detailed, but this was a frankly crazy amount of information to constantly keep track of just to make a wand. No wonder there are so few capable of it. The talent needed or dedication needed to pick up the craft is very large, he thought as he slipped into a dreamless slumber. The next day was no better as Ollivander first reviewed the information he had taught before having Nick tap various pieces of wood to get him used to implementing this knowledge. This is where Nick failed a lot, however, as he kept getting his information on different types of wood crossed as the information changed based on the wood in question. For example, oak was much sturdier than pine and thus needed a different approach to tapping. He was getting better, but it was slow going, not that Ollivander seemed to mind, as he said he expected as much. The next 2 days were spent with Nick reviewing his information and attempting to tap each piece of wood handed to him correctly. Chapter 184, A Rat in Hand. Friday finally came, freeing Nick from his lessons for the next 3 days, but he couldn't just laze about during this time, as he had received a reply from Ron's father telling him that Moody would be coming to get him early on Saturday to take care of business. The deep strokes of the quill on the parchment spoke volumes on the pent-up anger that the writer had, and Nick knew it was only the man's self-control stopping him from attacking Pettigrew already. Soon enough we'll trap the bastard, Nick thought seriously, impatiently. Meanwhile the rat in question was oblivious to the trap that was slowly starting to close around him as Ron fed him scraps of eggs and bacon from his plate. Arthur had been watching the rat for several days now, and the more he saw the angrier he became, as he felt like a fool for not noticing the problems with the rat sooner. A decade, an entire decade's worth of time has passed, and the rat has barely aged at all despite having a lifespan half that long. One more day, just one more day, and this scumbag would get what he deserves. Hold it together, Arthur, the head of the house, reminds himself. Alastair Moody was gearing up for the next day as well by putting a spare wand in his enchanted leather coat with far too many pockets. He had all manner of protective and offensive charms in this coat, to the point the thing was a hazard to even get near for anyone else. He had his hag's tone cuffs that he developed for wandless magic users despite their rarity, a pair of curse-resistant gloves, 3 bezoars, and various other just-in-case items hidden on him as he sharpened his mind on the task awaiting him, as he needed to act like he wasn't aware of the rat's nature when he arrived with Nick. Remus Lupin was also preparing, as he had cleaned up from his vagabond lifestyle after getting Dumbledore's letter and had been shaking the rust off his magical skills. Living day to day in the shoes of a werewolf in the underbelly of the wizarding world had taught Remus how to act very well and control his emotion, but even still he was boiling inside when he learned the truth of that night so long ago. Despite their admittedly small part in this whole plan to free Sirius, the Tonks family was also pulling their weight. For example, Ted had gone to Azkaban using his clearance as a lawyer to speak with Sirius personally and had verified everything Nick had said. The haggard-looking black looked like he had fresh life injected into him once Ted spoke of the foolproof plan to catch the rat who should have taken his place in the cell this whole time. He had almost insisted on breaking out to take care of Pettigrew himself, but Ted convinced him to think of Harry, which was enough to placate the man for now. Andromeda, on the other hand, had been pulling strings on the light side faction to put pressure on Lucius Malfoy to stop the slime ball from trying anything funny. The man was scrabbling to combat the attacks from several different angles, which forced him to turn a blind eye to the ministry at the moment. A certain house elf had been the object of the man's aggression, however, as he vented his anger out on the poor thing by having it punish itself harshly. Nick, however, spent the day within his mindscape in combat with Celebrimbor to prepare in case it comes to that. The old elf in question had been filled in on the entire situation and shared Nick's thirst to punish such a miserable excuse for a person like Pettigrew. For a elf such as him, who valued honor, integrity and pride above all else, Peter Pettigrew spat on all those things, angering the elf lord merely by existing. As a result, he went extra hard on Nick this time to prepare him for anything, despite knowing the rat likely suffered the same close quarters combat flaw of nearly all wizards in this world. Finally Saturday came, and Nick was fully geared and ready to take care of Pettigrew in any way necessary. Ollivander saw Nick's look of determination and merely wished him well when Moody arrived at the shop at 7 exactly. He was so focused that he didn't even notice the discomfort of the apparition. "Put on a smile, boy, can't risk spooking the rat now that we are so close to getting him," Moody said gruffly, and Nick cracked down on his emotions with his occlumency before putting on a casual expression like usual that was flawless enough that even Moody was convinced. Chapter 185, A Rat in Hand, 2. The two walked towards the strange-looking building that looked like someone had sewn on additional parts of other buildings at random to it. Moody used disillusionment on himself, and Nick knocked on the thick wooden door. A middle-aged-looking man with red hair and freckles opened the door wide, letting Moody pass by silently while he greeted Nick. "You must be Ron and the other's father. Pleased to meet you officially. Nicholas Ravenclaw." Nick greeted the man with a smile that looked completely natural. "Arthur Weasley, my sons have spoken nothing but praise for you since they came home." The man tried to act normal but clearly still was a bit stiff. "Not to worry, I'll make sure they are well taken care of while I am here," Nick said with a double meaning that the man picked up on and seemed to relax a little. "Enough gabbing about at the door, please come in. We were just eating breakfast, so when we are done the boys are all yours," Arthur said with his own double-meaning sentence. Basically Nick and Moody were to wait until after breakfast to move on Pettigrew so it doesn't affect his family as much. "As it just so happened I myself haven't had breakfast yet. I do hope I might join in if it's no trouble," Nick said with his same smile. The woman of the house, Molly Weasley, spoke up from the table nearby where the family was eating. "It's no bother at all, dear, please pull up a seat," she said, and with a wave of her wand had a chair and a plate ready and waiting. Nick thanked her for her kindness with a genuine smile this time and sat down before adding some bacon and eggs to the plate and began to eat. Do you add peppercorn to the bacon? He soon asked, tasting the flavor from the crispy thick-cut bacon. Molly smiled widely. Oh my yes, though no one ever seems to notice. She said, happy to brag about her cooking skills. Nick nodded. The trick to really bring out the flavor is to roast the things before you grind them. He said helpfully, causing a look of surprise to cross Harry's and the entire Weasley family's faces. You cook? Ron asked incredulously, and Nick genuinely chuckled. I dabble a bit, nothing to brag about, I assure you. He said humbly, despite it being untrue. In his memory right now there were countless recipes from the books at Hogwarts that he had learned, though most were outdated by a lot. Nonsense, simply being able to cook is more than I can say for any of my boys despite my insistence. Molly said, as if she was trying to hint for her children to be more like him. Arthur was much more relaxed, seeing how calmly Nick was handling the situation, while Moody was trying to figure out how he was so good at inserting himself into a situation so seamlessly, as it was a great skill to have. Breakfast passed by with none of the unaware seeing through Nick, as he even snuck some food to Peter to get the man to lower his guard even further. After all, who acts kind before attacking you normally? After the meal was over, Nick, Ron, and Harry were left in the living room with Ron's parents, as the rest all left to do something or other. Ah! Right before I forget, I have a gift for your pet rat. Nick said, like he had suddenly remembered. Really? What for? Ron asked, confused and surprised. I hadn't really thought of it before, but there is a lot of cats at Hogwarts and it's honestly lucky none of them have gotten him yet, so I made a ring to protect it from attacks. The best part is that it also works as a collar, so no one might think it's not owned if he gets out. Nick said while taking the prepared ring out of greed with a smile. Ron smiled widely. Thanks mate, you're the best. He said and held the rat up eagerly. Peter was also very interested in a personal protective object, since much like Nick had said, he had only evaded getting eaten by a cat by being smart enough to escape. Nick held the ring in front of the rat's face and it eagerly pressed its whole head through the hole before freezing as the magic took hold. Rapidly the rat grew heavier and heavier as its size increased, causing Ron to drop it in horror as soon a fat mouse-faced man was laying on the floor with a shocked expression. Moody dropped his charm and appeared seemingly out of thin air. Peter Pettigrew, you are under arrest for being an illegal animagus as well as helping the Dark Lord murder Lily and James Potter. He spoke harshly with his wand pointed at Peter. Chapter 186, Explaining. Peter made a face like he was straining to do something, but Nick scoffed at him. You are wasting your time, that piece of metal around your neck forces you to stay in your human form. He said. Peter had a look of horror on his face as he finally realized that escape was pretty much impossible. I'm innocent, please believe me. He said very slowly, as if he couldn't move his muscles like he wanted to, and his confusion at it showed. Nick grinned viciously. And that is the weakening curse placed on the thing to stop you from trying to steal a wand or run. He said, cutting off all hope for the man. You didn't mention that it would do that. Moody said, having been caught off guard by this sudden addition. Are you going to complain about something that makes your job easier? Nick asked with a raised eyebrow at the grizzled man. Moody shook his head and chuckled in a grating manner. No, but the plan may have been different if I had known. The man said in what may as well have been a complaint even if it wasn't technically. Someone explain what in Merlin's saggy robes is going on right now. Ron cut in, clearly freaked out by the happenings. His father wanted to step forward to comfort his son, but Nick stopped him. Let me handle it, you need to speak to the rest of your family about this situation. He said, and Arthur sighed but agreed. Looking at Ron and Harry, who were both shell-shocked by this event, though for different reasons, Nick sighed. Follow me both of you and I'll explain when you are far enough away from this place not to do anything stupid. He said before leading them away from Moody and Pettigrew, who was currently being bound in various ways by the old Auror. Once in the field outside the house, Nick finally spoke. What do the two of you know about the night Harry lost his parents exactly? He asked seriously, catching them off guard. His family was attacked by you-know-who and he was the only survivor, right? Ron asked, not understanding what it had to do with what had just happened. Nick shook his head. It's quite a bit more complicated than that, I am afraid. He said with a sigh. To get the full picture I need to explain a few details that are key to that night. First was that Harry's father had three people who he considered his closest friends ever since his days in Hogwarts: Sirius Black, Remus Lupin, and Peter Pettigrew. During the height of the war with the Dark Lord, they were on the front lines defending against the man and his followers when a prophecy was told about the man's downfall coming in the form of a newborn child. Harry was that child, and so knowing the Dark Lord would stop at nothing to kill Harry, these three friends implemented a plan to keep him safe. Nick paused to let all this sink in. This plan involved a very special type of charm called the Fidelius charm that made it impossible to find their hiding location so long as the person designated as secret keeper did not tell anyone else the secret. Keep in mind that becoming the secret keeper was the same as painting a massive target on one's back for the Dark Lord to target, a heavy burden. Unlike what many assumed, however, the strongest member of the group, Sirius, rejected becoming the secret keeper to act as bait for the Dark Lord while the true secret keeper remained hidden. Nick paused again. Unfortunately, his replacement was none other than Peter Pettigrew in this case, who he thought he could trust with this burden. What none of them knew, however, was that Peter had been the Dark Lord's informant for quite some time and had been telling the man of all their plans. So soon after becoming the secret keeper, Peter brought the Dark Lord straight to the Potter's hiding place, and the events of that act are well known. Nick said seriously. Driven mad with rage and grief, Sirius tracked Peter down, fully intent on killing the man, and Peter framed him for the betrayal as well as breaking the statute and murder by using a blasting charm on a group of muggles while sacrificing a finger to seem as though he too had died without a body. In truth, however, he had escaped after losing that finger and had hidden as the family pet rat of the Weasleys until now, thanks to the fact he was an animagus whose animal form was a common rat. Nick finished speaking with a sigh. Chapter 187, Persuading Fudge. Nick's two friends were left in shock and disbelief after he was done explaining the gist of what had happened so very long ago. He didn't blame them for not being able to process it all at once, since it was indeed quite a lot to take in. About 5 minutes later, Harry was the first to break up the silence with a question. How did this happen if Peter was hidden so well? He asked, confused. Nick pointed to himself. That would be entirely my own doing, actually. He said honestly. You see, after I learned but what truly happened to Harry's family, I started digging into their past and found a bunch of things that didn't add up, and after some more digging I figured out the truth of the situation. I admit that Peter was well hidden, however he forgot one very important detail that gave him away and set all of this in motion: lifespan. The average lifespan for a common rat such as his animagus form is a mere 5 years, and Ron's family has had him for over a decade despite him being an adult when they first found him. I found several coincidences that simply didn't add up until I discovered the truth and knew that I needed to do something about, and waited until after the school year was out to act. Nick explained, honest to a degree, the way it played out. Why didn't you tell me? Ron asked, looking hurt and angry at the same time. Nick sighed and shook his head. And what good would that have done besides tipping the rat off and having him escape, leaving the only family that actually cares about Harry to rot in Azkaban? This was the best option, and I did the best I could with what I had. He said honestly. After that, neither Ron or Harry spoke to Nick for the rest of the time he was at the Burrow, which he could accept as the price for his actions. Dumbledore and Lupin showed up as well to take Peter to the DMLE to make an appeal on Sirius's behalf. Nick needed to remove the ring around Peter's neck, however, under Dumbledore's request, after the old wizard promised that he wouldn't allow Peter to escape. He was reluctant to cut Peter any slack to possibly make a break for it, but did as asked while making his displeasure known. Nick himself, however, borrowed the flow powder of the Weasleys to go to the Ministry to deal with the biggest obstacle to freeing Sirius, Minister Fudge. Nick walked out of the green flames of the Ministry's fireplace and patted off the thick soot on his clothes before walking towards the sign labeled Minister's Office. Despite his tender age, no one seemed to feel like stopping him after seeing the look on his face that spoke of his determination. Soon enough, Nick arrived at the secretary that had a desk outside the Fudge's office, as she worked directly under him. She was a heavy-set woman with a perpetual smile and bright pink outfit on and neatly curled brown hair. She noticed Nick immediately and carefully looked him over, but reserved judgment until spotting the Lord ring on his finger and deciding he was worth her time. "Is there something I can help you with, young man?" she asked with a sweet voice that sent shivers rising up along Nick's whole body from the sheer wrongness of it. "Could you please inform Minister Fudge that Nicholas Ravenclaw would like an audience?" he asked calmly. The woman had a calculating expression for a few moments before nodding and walking into the office behind her desk. She made sure to close the door behind her to make sure that Nick couldn't hear anything spoken behind it. A few minutes later the door opened and the woman stepped out with that same disgusting false smile on her face and looked at him. "The minister will see you now, Mr. Ravenclaw," she said, and Nick nodded and walked into the doorway. The office was neat and organized and had various pictures of Fudge with famous individuals as well as a few certificates. In the center of the room sat a large dark wooden desk that Nick couldn't recognize from the dense lacquer on it. "Ah, Nick, it is quite the pleasant surprise to see you. Please make yourself comfortable," Fudge said, eager to please. Nick sat in the chair on the opposite side of the desk and greeted Fudge politely. "Dolores, could you give us the room, please?" the minister asked, and though she didn't show it, the woman was clearly displeased being left out of the loop. Chapter 188, Persuading Fudge, 2. Still she left the office nonetheless and shut the door behind her as she did so. Fudge dropped the friendly appearance immediately. I have gotten some rather unappealing information from Dumbledore about something you are planning to do that makes the Ministry look bad, so explain yourself. He said, clearly unhappy with Nick. How would it make the Ministry look bad to give the wizarding world some positive news for a change? Nick asked with a crafty grin. Fudge looked surprised but interested nonetheless, so Nick continued to share his plan with the man to corrupt/convince him. The Ministry makes shocking discovery and fixes a mistake, all while setting the head of the Black family free and putting away the actual criminal. Think of the positive light this sort of thing would shine on you, the minister who orchestrated the whole thing. Praise from both Muggleborn and pureblood wizards, and you could also run it as a more just ministry under your leadership. Nick said, tempting Fudge with a beautiful picture. The man was nothing if not political, however, and what do you get out of this besides the backing of the Black family name? Fudge asked, concerned. Not a thing besides my best friend getting someone who actually cares about him to take care of him. Nick said honestly, which wasn't a lie, as he really didn't need Sirius for anything else, as he has wealth, reputation, and political power by his heritage alone. The only thing he truly lacked was power, but he was already rapidly traveling down that road as well, so he was good to go. Fudge was taken back by this response but saw that Nick didn't seem to be lying and accepted it at face value. I suppose all that leaves is what you'll be giving me for the trouble this matter will cause me. Fudge said with a greedy look. Nick sighed. Do be reasonable, what do you want exactly? He asked to get a rough base to haggle down from. He wasn't stupid enough to just accept whatever absurd thing Fudge may ask for immediately. A personalized enchanted ring, full funding for my upcoming campaign, and exclusive ministry contracting for your rings. Fudge definitely didn't hold back with his price either. Nick shook his head. The ring is acceptable and I need an exact number for the campaign, but the exclusivity contract is completely off the table. He rebutted. Fudge didn't seem bothered at all about this, as he had clearly been expecting such a refusal. He then said an outrageous number of galleons, which Nick immediately countered with a fraction of, making it clear he wasn't so easily taken advantage of. This back and forth bartering continued for the next 15 minutes before the final price for Fudge to not interfere with the release of Sirius set at 1 personalized ring and 20,000 galleons towards the man's next campaign. A pleasure doing business, Mr. Ravenclaw. I am sure you can see yourself out, as I am quite busy, you know. Fudge said, and Nick left the man's office with a smirk towards the pink toad that looked livid as he passed by, despite her constant false smile, as she even had a vein pulsing on her neck. The entire time Nick had been in the office she had been using magic to try and get material to blackmail him with, but Nick used his magical senses to pinpoint the intrusive magic and cancel it with his wand, stealthily leaving her nothing. Fudge was definitely aware of this fact, but was going to get a rude awakening when he learns of Umbridge's failure. Back to the shop I go, since my part in this whole mess is done and over with. Nick thought as he left the ministry, leaving the world ever so slightly better than it should be originally. Ollivander seemed to surprised to see Nick back so soon, since it seemed like it would take much longer with how serious it was. I'll be going again in a moment, I just need to grab Helena real fast. Nick explained, and the old man merely shrugged and nodded. The ghost in question was equally confused at Nick's presence, but after he explained the efficiency of the capture and political nonsense afterward, she didn't care anymore. What do you need me for though? She asked, confused why he came to get her and Steve, who was hanging out in a comfy transfigured pocket in Nick's shirt. The pocket's entrance was big enough for the Niffler to stick its head through and look around, but not enough for it to escape and go on a thieving spree should it get that inevitable urge. Chapter 189, Gringotts. I need to take a large amount of gold out of the account, and that means that I need to be present for it, and I figured it would be best to have you nearby as I get our family stuff here in order. Nick explained, and Helena nodded in agreement, as it would be hard for the goblins to pull any tricks with her there to point out any important details they try to slip past Nick due to outdated contracts. Steve was just happy to be out and about though, and looked at everything with wide, curious eyes. Considering that Gringotts was the second largest building in Diagon Alley and that he had already known its position from the shop, it didn't take Nick and Helena long to get there. Once again Nick bribed and greeted the heavily armed goblin at the front door before going into the busy bank. Walking up to a teller, Nick placed a galleon at the edge of the podium, which brought the goblin's attention to himself. Welcome to Gringotts. What do you seek to do today? The goblin said with the standard lackluster attitude of the goblins. Family management and a large withdrawal of funds from the account. Nick said, all business. The goblin leaned forward to really give Nick a look over, and despite its eyes stopping briefly on the various rings on Nick's hands, it particularly focused its gaze on the Lord ring. Satisfied with what it saw, the goblin sat back down and reached for one of the many bells stored in a drawer behind the podium that curiously had the Ravenclaw house crest on it, and rang it. Some of the other goblins working froze when the sound went out and looked at the podium in question with wide surprised eyes. The reason for this was that each goblin bell had a different sound that only creatures with really sensitive hearing like goblins could differentiate, and the Ravenclaw account had long been used to punish people with stagnation due to its lack of use. As a result, only those who had memorized each possible bell sound recognized this bell's significance. The only exception to this was a middle-aged goblin with a scar through his right eye that had a look of disbelief and excitement on his face as he walked towards the podium Nick was standing in front of. "My name is Grimgrip and I am in charge of the Ravenclaw account, Mr. Grimgrip said while trying to get Nick to introduce himself. "Nicholas I. Ravenclaw," Nick said with an extended hand which the goblin took eagerly. "Pleasure to make your acquaintance, Mr. Nicholas. Please follow me to an open room to discuss the state of your accounts," Grimgrip said professionally. Gringotts always had rooms set up specifically for talking in private with the many customers of the bank. The room Nick and Helena were led to was a plain thing with a simple low table with wide proportions and a few simple padded chairs. Grimgrip took a seat on one side of the table and Nick took a seat on the other. "If it is no trouble, can I ask why the Ravenclaw house seemed to abandon their account for the last 1,000 years?" the goblin asked fairly bluntly. "Helena here was the last known heir to the family until I myself recently had an inheritance test performed on me," Nick explained, and Grimgrip nodded in understanding. "The long way it is then," he said, and rang a bell that was sitting on the table, summoning another goblin. "Bring me everything we have on the Ravenclaw account," Grimgrip said, and the other goblin looked taken back for a moment but left to do so anyways. "Due to the lack of understanding in regards to your family's account you have, we will need to go over everything pertaining to it. This will take quite a while, so I hope you don't have any plans," Grimgrip said with a chuckle. Nick soon found out that this was no joke either, as several thick piles of parchment were brought into the room and placed on the table before them. 6 hours later and they finally went through the vast pile of paperwork, thanks to Helena helping to sort the active and closed events of the files based on her memory at the start that cut the work down considerably. In this process Nick actually learned that the Ravenclaw family had ties to the Peverell family through an unfinished contract involving a certain set of potion ingredients that couldn't be delivered due to the death of the known Ravenclaw family members. It was honestly a little lackluster of a connection, but finding any information is very difficult for some reason, as if all records of them were erased past a certain point. Chapter 190, Family Assets. Nick found it exceedingly unusual how such a powerful family had all but been erased from history. To the point in fact that not even the direct descendants of the three brothers were aware of it. Looking at the history books he had read during the last school year to get an actual overview of the world's magical history that had not really been covered in the books from his past life, Nick had discovered this inconsistency. From his own knowledge of each possessor of the wand, Nick had also discovered that the Deathly Hallows themselves were created during the 13th century and thus after the founder's time. This explained why the Peverell family had records like this one, as it was before the Hallows drove the family to near extinction. Not that this has anything to do with me, he thought, dismissing his thoughts on that family and focusing on the other things he had learned. First and foremost was that Rowena Ravenclaw had cleverly left a way to manipulate the wards of Hogwarts for her descendants. It was a small thing involving creating a minor resonance between her bloodline and the founding wards that hold up the ones placed later by the headmasters. This meant that despite having removed any ownership of the castle that her descendants would have, she still made sure that they still got special treatment. There was a warning left behind, however, stating that the other founders had done the exact same thing for their own descendants. This was vital information for Nick, as it meant that he finally understood why Dumbledore couldn't get rid of the curse Voldemort had placed on the opposition. It was not because he didn't want to, but because he simply couldn't without taking down the entire ward system. This sounds like an easy thing to fix, since you could just copy the whole ward scheme before taking it apart to remove the curse attached to it. The problem, however, was that the wards themselves were made using techniques that had been lost, and thus once removed no one knew how to put them back up. Simply put, Dumbledore's only solution to removing the curse at the moment was to wait for Voldemort to truly die, releasing his bloodline imprint and thus curse. Nick, however, now had another solution in the form of placing his own bloodline imprint and using that to purge the curse. "I'll wait until Lockhart is gone before I do that though," Nick thought seriously while adding this to his rather long mental list of things to do later. Other than this, there was not much that he wasn't already aware of in regards to his family's legal assets. Almost all the deals from so long ago were impossible to truly complete due to the people involved being long dead and thus voiding them out. The only things not in this category was the ownership of the island with the house, and surprisingly the right to claim a house elf should the one serving the family perish. Obviously this was the case, since whatever house elf that lived 1,000 years ago had long since been decayed into dust. Getting a new house elf was surprisingly easy, as Grimgrip merely rang a bell and had a young one summoned from the colony of the things. It was a small creature with the large ears and eyes that the race was known for, that had a face full of freckles and a clean linen toga-style robe that covered the important parts. "This one is Dotty, sir, and is happy to finally have a master," the elf said eagerly. "My name is Nicholas Ravenclaw, and you are to serve the Ravenclaw family from now on. Faithfully, understood?" Nick asked seriously. "Dotty understands, Sir Ravenclaw. It is this one's greatest joy to serve the Ravenclaw family," Dotty said with a wide smile and a deep bow. Taking a couple galleons out of greed, Nick handed them over to Dotty. "Your first order is to improve the quality of your clothes to match your status as the servant of the prestigious Ravenclaw family," he said. "Understood, sir," the elf said seriously before snapping its fingers and vanishing in with a loud pop. "No offense meant, Mr. Ravenclaw, but that seems like a waste of funds to have a servant dress expensively," Grimgrip said honestly. "When you look at one's household, what is the first thing you look at to determine wealth?" Nick asked with a crafty grin. The goblin thought about the question before answering. "How lavish everything is, of course," he said honestly. Nick nodded. "And what would be more of a flex of wealth than a house elf wearing fine clothing?" he asked, and the goblin smiled widely as it figured why Nick did this. Chapter 191, Divine Tree. Now whenever Nick summoned his house elf in public, whoever saw it would think he had an abundance of money even if he didn't. That wasn't to say that he didn't have a stupid amount of money at his disposal, as he finally got an exact number of coins in his vault. Around 500 million galleons, 200,000 sickles and nearly 50,000 nuts in total wealth. That didn't even include rare tomes, materials, and other things that were also in the vault waiting to be found that weren't explicitly stated in the paperwork. Well, now that all of this is done with, it's time to move on to today's actual business. I need to make a transfer of funds from my account to Mr. Fudge's political account in the amount of 20,000 galleons. Nick said, and both Grimgrip and Helena looked at him in shock. He shook his head at their looks. "No need to be alarmed, I will profit far more from this deal than Fudge will," he said, and explained the gist of the situation. "Tying the Black family name to yourself for a measly 20,000 galleons is indeed a good deal," Grimgrip said appreciatively. "Goblins value profit over a great many things, and this deal with Fudge to allow Sirius to be freed will bring a great deal of profit to Nick in the future. I imagine you wish to see your vault then, correct?" Grimgrip asked eagerly. Nick nodded, and the Grimgrip rang a bell again and had a paper jockey goblin return the now organized paperwork to the appropriate place. Nick was then led to the special cart that the goblins used to traverse the deep tunnels under the bank. It was a rather long cart ride to the Ravenclaw vault that was also known as Vault 3, with it being amongst the first vaults set up by Gringotts. The vault door itself was a metal slab covered in so many enchantments that Nick grew pale, barely sensing them with his magical senses. The sheer amount of defensive and offensive enchantments on the door made him instinctively want to stay far away from it instead of get closer to place his signet ring into the slot. Yes, the key to the vault was the active Lord ring on his finger, and he needed to press the signet into the special indented to open the vault. Still, he did so and marveled as the vault door rumbled and started falling apart into grains of sand that melted into the door frame seamlessly. "A bit dramatic for my tastes, but impressive all the same," Nick said after the process was done and the small mountain of coin was shown within the vault. "Mother always had a flair for the dramatic," Helena said with a shrug. Walking into the vault, Nick couldn't help but marvel at what he saw. Rows of ancient tomes, rare metals, and even potions thought long lost held under preservation spells. The most impressive thing, however, was a large tree held in temporal stasis with white bark and golden leaves on its branches, as well as small flower buds. Appraising the tree with the system, Nick had to stop his jaw from hitting the floor at what he read. Divine Tree, Golden Apple, Mana deprived/dying. Grade, Mythical. Abilities, Singular, Holy, Life Domain. Mythical ability, Golden Apples, grows golden apples that can cure any disease and extends one's lifespan by a single year each. Where the fuck did she even find something like this? Nick thought in equal parts horror and curiosity after reading the appraisal. He couldn't be blamed either, as this tree was likely the very same one that Heracles himself had to retrieve an apple from as part of his labors. This raised a big red flag in Nick's mind, however, that concerned him greatly. Does this mean that gods actually existed at some point? He thought worriedly. Sure, there were myths and legends all over the world about gods, but many wizards agreed it was likely just super powerful wizards in the end. But this tree's very existence hinted at the fact that gods did exist in the past, but they were gone now, which was not good news at all for Nick. If they left Earth for whatever reason, then nothing was stopping them from returning, and if they had died, he needed to figure out what could do such a thing. Ugh, why does this world have to be so much more complicated than the books showed? He complained mentally, but didn't think it unreasonable in reality. Even more concerning was the status of the tree's health next to its name, mana deprived. Does this mean that there is simply not enough ambient mana to sustain the tree? Is that why the gods seemed to vanish as well? He pondered but simply couldn't understand the situation from this tiny piece of the puzzle. Chapter 192, Book. While both Grimgrip and Helena showed interest in the tree, they clearly weren't aware of its true significance and soon looked over at the rest of the undocumented items in the vault. Steve on the other hand was whining and struggling to try and leave the pocket he was in to get to the small mountain of glittering silver and gold. Nick had made sure that this was impossible when he decided to bring the greedy little one alongside them on this trip, since he knew how the Niffler would react. The poor creature was clearly distressed at the inability to pilfer the vast hoard of wealth before it, but Nick ignored it. Instead he turned his attention towards the bookshelf at the side of the vault that held only a handful of books. Despite the stasis charm on them, they looked positively ancient, which meant that they were likely very old when Rowena Ravenclaw obtained them. Perhaps one of these books might shed some light on the situation. Nick thought and walked over to the bookshelf and reached out to grab a book. It was an animal hide-bound thing with thick papyrus pages and extreme signs of age. There was no title on the cover, so Nick carefully opened it to reveal the contents of the first page. There were lines of dense markings that Nick knew were words thanks to his ability, but that he didn't recognize at all. He could read the writing of course, but he honestly didn't know what language this was at all. For whomever may be reading this work, know that if you are below the first threshold of power, that the contents of this work may result in your demise. If you wish to avoid this possibility, put this work back where you found it until you reach the first threshold. That was the first thing written in the book and concerned Nick greatly, as he had no idea what this first threshold of power mentioned was. Obviously this book was written by some seriously ancient wizard, but he didn't know exactly how ancient. This was a problem, as it meant he had no idea if he met the prerequisite to read what was held within this book's pages. Rather than risk it and read further, Nick closed the book and put it back on the shelf before grabbing a set loosely tied together treated skins. This was the most primitive looking book he had ever seen, and so he carefully flipped it open and nearly had his jaw drop at what he found. The path to power is a long and arduous one that very few of those blessed by the world can truly travel. My name is Kronos, and I write this as a record for a future I have seen that is long after my time, when the world is set to begin recovering from the great collapse. May the flow of time favor you, ringmaker. Nick felt a shiver go down his spine after reading this excerpt, as the author was very clearly writing this book knowing that Nick would eventually read it. Forget decades, this person foresaw a future that was likely millennium after his time. Was this written by the Kronos, as in the Titan King of Time? Nick's thoughts were of horror and discomforting realization when he looked at the book in his hands. He didn't know how it was possible, but apparently this Kronos person, whoever that is, had foreseen the future so far that they had written a book addressed specifically to Nick. Helena seemed to notice Nick's expressions as she floated over with a concerned expression. "What is written here that has you so frightened?" she asked, worried about him. Nick clamped down on his emotions with a clemency and took a few deep breaths to calm himself. "It was written to me," Nick revealed seriously, earning a shocked expression from Helena, as she could clearly tell that he wasn't lying but that the book was beyond ancient. The implications of this weren't lost on her, but she found it hard to believe nonetheless. "How do you know for sure?" she asked, hoping to be able to refute this world-shattering revelation, but Nick merely reread the passage from the book, making her go eerily silent as she processed this information. "No one else can know about this," Nick said, and Helena nodded seriously as Nick stored the book away in greed. Clearly he needed to read this book to understand what was so important that someone would write it addressing him personally millennium later. Hopefully it wasn't something along the lines of him being the savior of the world or some such, as he had no wanting to take this role at all. Chapter 193, Quick Ministry Work. Nick didn't dare try to open any other book on the shelf until he read the entirety of the one addressed to him. Nick stepped away from the bookshelf and started to appraise the various things that he couldn't immediately identify. Most of it was merely rare things from the Founder's time, such as extinct plants or magical creature parts. There was a couple of things that were listed as mythical, but neither were on the level of the tree. One of them was a rare seed of conjunction fire that formed when all of the planets in a solar system lined up perfectly. Such a fire was born and died within literal seconds, so getting a seed of it was a true treasure even if you had no use for it, like Rowena Ravenclaw likely didn't. The woman was an enchanter, not a craftsman, so a fire seed was pretty much the height of useless for her, so she likely stored it in the vault as the treasure it was. The second item though was the exact opposite, in that it was useless to Nick but likely very useful to Rowena Ravenclaw thanks to its properties. This item was a bloodstone that, according to the system, contained the blood of over 1,000 different magical beasts. Bloodstones were unique magical rocks that had been naturally enchanted to absorb the properties of whatever blood touched it. The reason this was useful for Rowena and not Nick was that the stone could display the characteristics of the blood it had been exposed to be copied into a wizard's magic and later into a unique enchantment from that now nourished copy. The problem was that this only applied to human magicals and Nick was an elf now, so the stone, despite being very valuable, was useless to him. Satisfied with his observations of the vault, Nick approached the small mountain of coins and began to count out 20,000 of the galleons. Grimgrib made sure that he only grabbed that amount since that was the amount he was transferring to Fudge's account. With this taken care of, we are done here, Nick said sternly, and Grimgrib closed the expanded coin purse holding the galleons. They left Gringotts after Nick was made to sign the paperwork regarding the transfer of funds to Fudge's account. Grimgrib got a tidy commission from the transfer, which seemed to put the goblin in a pleasant mood as they left. Ollivander greeted them when they returned to the shop, but also noticed the tired look on Nick's face and suggested he turn in early. It was good advice, and Nick was more than happy to shower and go straight to bed after such a long day. A lot had happened in the span of this one day, from the capture of Peter Pettigrew, to finding out that the world was a whole hell of a lot more complicated than he first thought. All in all, Nick was quite mentally drained at the moment, and he knew it, so straight to bed it was for him. Nick didn't even realize it until he woke up that he had slept until noon the next day, which was a Sunday and one of his free days. He was greatly startled, however, to find Dottie standing next to his bed eagerly waiting to serve. Helena burst into laughter when Nick practically punched Dottie when he opened his eyes to the sight of the eager house elf. Clearly his fight or flight reflexes were geared towards fight, though the elf got lucky he stopped his fist in time because he hadn't held back. Dottie had done as Nick had commanded though, and was now wearing a blue and silver silk robe with the Ravenclaw family crest on the front. Getting dressed, Nick greeted Ollivander in the shop, embarrassed from having slept in, but the old man merely laughed it off. Checking the paper, Nick raised an eyebrow at the headline, "Ministry Rights Wrong. True criminal awaits trial." Amazing how quickly things get done when you grease the wheels, he thought, a sigh that bribery was even needed to get justice done. Still, Nick read through the article and could only chuckle at the sheer amount of credit Fudge had decided to take from those actually responsible. The whole article was basically boiled down to Fudge did everything important, with everyone else getting honorable mentions. Dumbledore wasn't even included in the paper despite his involvement, which was hilarious in Nick's opinion. Still, there was a few snippets of important information in the article, like Sirius's immediate release from Azkaban and the date of the trial for Peter. According to the article, Sirius was now at St. Mungo's getting treated for the effects of his decade-long stay at the prison. Chapter 194, Ravenclaw Island. Knowing the man's personality, I should expect a visit from him once he leaves the hospital, Nick thought before putting the paper down and letting Ollivander know he was going to check out the Ravenclaw Island today. "Oh? I had assumed you would wait for quite a while before checking that place out. What changed?" the old man asked curiously. "Dottie," Nick called, and the house elf immediately appeared in front of him, eager to receive his orders. "Before yesterday I would have needed help getting to that area, but with a house elf to transport us it is much easier now," Nick said honestly. Ollivander smiled. "House elves are indeed convenient things to have at hand for traveling," he said in agreement. "The plan is for Dottie here to bring Helena to the coast near the island before coming back to get the two of us, or just me if you'd prefer to stay here," Nick explained casually. Ollivander chuckled. "I wouldn't miss seeing the home of Rowena Ravenclaw for anything, just the thought of it gets me excited," he said with an eager expression. "Before all that though, we need a map of England to give Dottie a place to go with Helena," Nick said honestly. "Then we are in luck, as I just so happen to have such a thing, though a bit special," Ollivander said before reaching into a drawer behind the counter and pulling out an old scroll of paper that was nearly 2 feet tall. Unfurling to on the counter, Nick was surprised to see a real-time image of the entire island with cities, clouds, and accurate topography. "Whew, now that's pretty impressive enchanting right there. How did you get the weather to work so well without ruining the paper?" Nick asked, seeing the rain falling on parts of the image. Ollivander shook his head. "As much as I can appreciate your enthusiasm, I am afraid I can't take credit for the enchantments here. I bought this map while traveling in my younger days from an Egyptian wizard in the Cairo magical market," he said with a nostalgic look. Nick was surprised to hear this, as a complex enchantment like this usually would have failed by now without a source of power or anchor, but he couldn't find either. "It really is a masterful enchantment if that's true, since it seems to lack the parts needed for longevity like this," Nick said in appreciation. With that matter settled, Ollivander closed up the shop and Helena went over to the map after Dottie went and got her from the room. After looking at the map carefully, she pointed to a spot at the southwestern part of England opposite Plymouth by the Celtic Sea. Dottie memorized this spot's detail before grabbing Helena when she turned corporeal and vanishing from the store. 10 minutes later the house elf returned and grabbed Ollivander, this time before vanishing once more. 1 minute later Dottie reappeared and grabbed Nick before vanishing from the store. As it turned out, using a house elf to apparate somewhere was way easier on the body than wizarding apparition. Nick had the sneaking suspicion that it was because the wizarding version is not as refined due to wizards using the house elves for travel most of the time. Besides a little dizziness, Nick didn't even feel the trip to this spot, which was sheer cliffs all along the coast. The salty sea breeze and warm weather made it a pleasant spot to visit for a picnic if nothing else. Nick thought with a grin. As much as I enjoy the scenery, I'd like to know how we are finding this hidden island you told me about. Nick spoke up to be heard over the sound of wind and crashing waves. Helena grinned and waved Nick over to a moss-covered boulder that fit in perfectly near the edge of the cliff. He walked over, curious what she had planned, and after turning corporeal she brushed the moss off a specific spot on the stone to reveal a very familiar indent. Nick was speechless seeing this, as he couldn't believe Rowena Ravenclaw had hidden the key to her home in plain sight. Pressing the signet ring into the indent, Nick noticed his magical energy get sucked into the ring and then passed into the stone in vast amounts. He almost pulled away his hand in surprise had Helena not stopped him. It's been without fuel for 1,000 years but will not need so much next time, she explained, and he relaxed. Thankfully the stone stopped taking energy after draining about half of his entire magic pool. The stone was also much different in his magical senses, as well as it was now very clearly filled with a headache-inducing amount of enchantments. Chapter 195, Ravenclaw Island, 2. He also felt the stone's energy flowing deep under it and out of his senses range as he stood still waiting to see what would happen. Soon cliff face began to morph and shift into a set of rocky stairs leading into the sea below. The group began to descend these stairs and only stopped at the edge of the water. Once again there was an indent in the stone wall of the cliff, and with a roll of his eyes and a groan Nick pressed the ring into the socket and let it suck out his energy. By the time it was done he was basically totally out of magical energy and had a headache from the expenditure as well. If it helps, that should be the last time you need to do that on this trip, Helena said apologetically. I certainly hope so, or things are going to get awkward very fast, Nick joked while ignoring his headache. Soon the water began to bubble like it was boiling, but a seaweed and barnacle-covered carriage rolled out of the water and sat atop it waiting for them to enter it. It's official, your mother was paranoid as hell, Nick said after seeing the layers of verification required to get to the island. Helena giggled but did not deny this as she stepped into the carriage with Ollivander following after her, with Nick and Dottie going last. Once the door to the carriage was closed, the whole thing began to dive below the sea without its passengers needing to worry about getting wet at all. I'll need to clean this carriage eventually because I am sure I am missing quite the sight out the windows, Nick thought as he tried to see outside, but the windows were covered in barnacles and seaweed. After an hour-long ride the carriage finally began its ascent towards the surface, indicating that they were getting close to the island. The preservation charms your mother cast affected the entire island or just the building? Nick asked, having a bad feeling about what they are about to find. Just the building, why? Helena asked curiously. You might want to leave the carriage first to make sure we aren't attacked by the overgrown island's inhabitants, Nick said, and Helena's eyes widened as she realized that without someone to keep it in check for the last 1,000 years the plants and animals on the island have definitely taken control of the place. Nodding her head seriously, Helena prepared herself to turn ghostly in order to scout out the situation on the island. Soon sunlight began to shine through the uncovered parts of the windows and she phased through the wall of the carriage with her head before pulling it back in. The island is overgrown but nothing dangerous is near the carriage dock, she reported with a relieved look. Nick waited for the carriage to come to a stop before opening the door carefully. Immediately he was greeted by a barely standing stone structure that was probably the dock that had creeping vines and gillyweed covering it. He wasn't good at handling magical plants, but both of these kinds were harmless, so he stepped out of the carriage carefully while making sure not to slip of the slick surface under his feet. Mr. Ollivander, could you use a fire charm to burn away a dry spot for us? Nick asked the old man, since he didn't want to reveal his lack of trace over such a small matter. Ignio. Ollivander spoke, and a gout of flames flew from his wand and began to dry up and burn away the overgrown plants on the ground. Once a wide area was uncovered for them to step on safely, Nick moved over to that area and Ollivander redirected his flames to the spot under the carriage to dry it up as well. Cancelling his spell, Ollivander finally stepped out of the doorway of the carriage and onto the island proper. Dottie, could you clean the carriage off all of this stuff while we work on restoring the path? Nick asked the elf, who bowed and agreed instantly before going to work. Alright, so first things first is that we need to slowly work our way along whatever path remains to the house, with Helena leading the way while you clear off the path as we go, Nick said to Ollivander, and the old wizard nodded seriously. Many people had forgotten, but Garrick Ollivander had adventured all over the world in pursuit of veritology knowledge, so he was well versed in the process for things like this, and Nick's plan was very solid. If they move carefully and clear the path back to the carriage as they go, then if they need to retreat becomes much easier. Chapter 196, Seram. They didn't get very far before they came across their first magical beast as they cleared the path. It was a large rodent covered in brown and tan feathers that was spooked when it saw them and ran away. "Please tell me your mother didn't have a breeding pair of those 1,000 years ago," Nick said pleadingly, and Helena looked away awkwardly. "At least they are fairly harmless normally," Helena said reassuringly. Nick didn't not feel very reassured though, since that was a Colorado or a Chilean feathered rat. They had a bad habit of draining energy from people, making them more and more tired over time if not gotten rid of. While not explicitly dangerous, that only applies when they are alone, as once more than a certain number of the things drained energy from someone in their sleep, they may get exhausted to death, and like most rats they reproduced very fast. 1,000 years was a long time for rats to be left undisturbed on an island, so there was no telling how many of the things there were. "Why in Merlin's name would you mom think keeping Colorado was a good idea?" Nick asked seriously. Helena looked embarrassed. "That's kind of my fault," she murmured under her breath, but Nick still heard her thanks to his elvish hearing that was more sensitive than a human's. "Yeah, I think I have a pretty good idea what happened now," he said with a teasing grin. "I was a young ignorant girl at one point, I'll have you know," Helena said defensively. Sure, but feathered rats? Not even I could have ever imagined you'd find such things cute." Nick teased his long-dead relative mercilessly while Ollivander watched with an amused expression. As they continued top clear out the path, they came across a few other magical creatures such as bowtruckles, horned serpents, and even Synopsis, which were large white deer creatures with wooden branches instead of antlers. Thankfully none of these species were that difficult to deal with, as they all tended to avoid people. Thankfully none of these species were unknown or particularly rare, so Nick wasn't concerned all that much. This changed with the next creature that they found, or to be more specific, it found them. It was a creature with the body of a lion with bat-like wings, the head of a woman, and the tail of a scorpion. It was a manticore that was also huge, which made sense considering it was likely over 1,000 years old. "Ah, the little mistress has returned it seems, and what a handsome little one who accompanies her." The beast speaks in a very human-sounding voice. "Seram." Helena squealed happily and rushed over to the massive manticore to embrace it. How I've missed you, my little one," the manticore said with a wide smile that revealed many sharp teeth as it gently draped a hug paw over Helena to return the embrace. "As touching as this reunion seems to be, can someone explain what's going on?" Nick asked, beyond confused why a vicious monster like a manticore was acting all friendly and caring towards a human, or rather ghost in this case. Wild manticores were verified and well-known man-eaters that, despite their human-level intelligence, actively targeted wizards to feast on for their magical energy, which was why they had been nearly hunted to extinction. "Seram is the guardian of the island that Mother raised alongside me when I was still in infancy. I thought after so long she would have passed away by now," Helena said with tearful eyes. Nick could see why she would get so emotional over finding out that this manticore named Seram was still alive. He wasn't surprised that it could live so long, considering that much like basilisk, manticores had a very long lifespan, with the oldest recorded one at 1,700 years old according to it. "I'm afraid your concern was quite valid in this case, as I have barely been able to survive off the offspring of those 2 feathered rats of yours and the Synopsis, but they barely contain enough energy to sustain me," Seram said honestly. Helena looked mortified after hearing this. "I'm so sorry for never coming, but I was rather lost for this whole time," she said, fading into her ghostly form. The manticore looked surprised. "So you truly have died?" it said with a sigh. "After so long I had assumed as such, but never did I think you would be a ghost. It seems we both have regrets that force us to linger in this world," Seram said sadly before turning serious and staring at Nick and Ollivander with a threatening look. Chapter 197, Ho Ho. "While there is no problem with her, you two are entirely unknown and trespassing to boot, so explain yourselves or prepare to be eaten," Seram said aggressively. Nick raised his hand to show the signet ring on it. "I am Nicholas I Ravenclaw, here to reclaim my ancestral home, and this is my teacher who is here to help in this regard," he said calmly but with authority. The manticore glanced at Helena and only relaxed when she nodded to confirm what he said. "Very well then, as the heir and lord of this estate, it is your duty to fulfill your ancestors' duty of satiating my hunger. You have 1 week exactly before I will assume you are offering your life to do so," Seram said calmly, as if talking about the weather and not eating someone. Nick chuckled at how blunt the manticore was and took out a couple of loaves of lembas bread. "Try this," he said, tossing them towards the creature casually. Saram snapped the 2 loaves up with a confused expression, since she was sure that there was no way such small things contained the energy needed to sustain her for very long. She was wrong. Almost immediately the chronic hunger that gripped at the edge of her mind and body faded away and a sense of fullness came over her. What is this strange food and how does it work? Saram asked, intrigued by the clearly magical food as she felt her strength recovering. A starving Manticore had very little power compared to a full one, but they had efficient bodies that could recover from most non-lethal conditions given enough food and time, including malnutrition. Lemba's bread, a magical bread that has all the nutrition and energy a normal human would need for a month per loaf, and you just ate enough to last a person 2 months. He said with a grin. Saram laughed. What a funny creation, sounds like something Helga would have created. She said, amused that such a convenient thing existed. All the credit for this stuff in this world goes to me actually. Nick said, not technically lying since he had asked for the recipe from Celebrimbor, who is only here because of the system that was part of him. Oh? Well, if you keep up the supply of that stuff, you and I will get along just fine, I think. Saram said cheerfully. Now that that's settled, I assume you don't mind if we continue clearing the way to the house, right? Nick asked seriously. Why would I care? It's your island, I just guard the place. The Manticore said with a shrug of its feline shoulders. A bit of warning though, the old bird may try to attack you all once it notices you here. Saram said offhandedly. That grouchy bastard is still here? I would have thought he'd leave by now. Helena said incredulously. What are you talking about exactly? Nick asked curiously. My mother once visited Japan at one point in time, and in exchange for enchanting something for the imperial family she was gifted a chick of their immortal bird species, a ho-ho, pronounced hoo-hoo. Normally the things don't make it into adulthood much like thunderbirds and phoenixes, but this one did, and as such is technically immortal. 1,000 years ago the thing had a terrible attitude and was a real nuisance. I had always assumed the bastard had left by now, but I guess he grew attached to this place, it seems. Helena explained honestly. I always wanted to see if ho-ho feathers were supreme wand ingredients like phoenix and thunderbird feathers, since they are all part of the same family. Unfortunately the feathers are a closely guarded asset of the imperial family, so I never could get my hands on them. Ollivander said, clearly excited by the idea of seeing such a creature. It will certainly be an interesting encounter. Nick agreed while wondering how such a creature would act in his presence. He hadn't met enough members of the immortal bird family to have a good idea, since he had only met Fox that was respectful. With Saram leading the way, no other magical beast dared to get close to the group as they cleared the path to the manor. This changed when they get within eyesight of the building that, just like Helena said, looked untouched by time if a bit overgrown. See ear. A bird cry much like that of an eagle or hawk sounded out before a large shadow fell over the group. Nick looked up without flinching at all to see a very large bird with black and red feathers and an appearance between an eagle and peacock swooping down claws first. Chapter 198, Ravenclaw Manor. Nick held out his arm with a smile, and under the stunned expressions of Helena and Saram had the very large bird gentle land on it. His shoulders sagged quite a lot, since the bird weighed quite a bit considering it was nearly the same size a decently tall person. Seeing how hard Nick had to struggle to keep his arm up, the bird quickly hopped onto his shoulder instead. That was much more stable. He still struggled with it of course, but at least he could still stand. Chirp. The bird sounded out as it craned its neck to make eye contact with Nick with a very familiar golden-colored set of eyes. I am officially jealous. Helena said with a pout. Nick chuckled and scratched the bird under its chin, which it seemed to enjoy immensely. At least he's not attacking us, right? He asked with a grin. Humph. She snorted angrily and walked towards the building. Ollivander meanwhile was marveling at the big bird currently occupying Nick's attention. Truly a wondrous creature. Now if I could just get a couple of feathers. He muttered under his breath with a calculating gaze. Both the bird and Nick heard this and turned to look at the old man, with Nick looking amused and the bird about 2 seconds away from ripping his face off. Don't mind him all that much, he has dedicated his life to the pursuit of wand making, so he tends to get a bit single-minded in this regard. If you give him a few loose feathers you were going to shed anyways, he'll be quite happy to leave you alone. Nick suggested, and the bird looked conflicted before it decisively plucked 4 of its feathers and dropped them before ignoring the old man, who scrambled to collect them as they fell. Nick hadn't lied either, as Ollivander had immediately began testing the various properties of the feathers while absent-mindedly following Nick as he walked over to the edge of the building's wards. Holding out his signet ring, the wards shimmered before dropping after accepting his magical signature. Knowing that Ollivander was too distracted to notice, Nick took out his wand and waved it, causing the overgrown plants on the building to vanish as he banished them. With them gone he finally got to see the real view of his ancestral home. It was a stone mansion that radiated dense magical energy, the likes of which only fell short of Hogwarts itself. The building appeared rather dirty from the dust and cobwebs that covered it, but Nick didn't mind that and walked up to the front door that was a large wooden construct with metal reinforcements and pulled on the handle. The door smoothly opened as if the hinges had been oiled just the day before, revealing the inside of the building. It was surprisingly plain, to be honest, as besides the fireplace, stair, and hallways leading to other rooms, the entrance hall was totally barren with plain stone floors and unpainted walls. Helena walked into the building with a nostalgic look as she got lost in memories of a time long since lost to her. Nick didn't disturb her and walked to the immediate right hallway to explore his new house. The hallways were apparently just as barren as the entrance hall, as there was nothing in them save the windows and doors leading to other rooms. Opening the first door, Nick saw that it was a fairly barren guest room with a bed and chamber pot, but nothing else. The next two doors led to similar things, which came as little surprise, all things considered at this point. Leaving that hallway, Nick went to the other side of the mansion and found Helena in the first room of that hallway. The room had far more decorations, from various books to drapes on the windows, a dresser, and even a gold full-length mirror in the corner. There was a mess in the room with clothes strewn about and spell marks on the stone walls. With the look on Helena's face as she walked around the room, he knew that this was likely her own room. Leaving Helena to her thoughts, Nick walked further down the hall and found the kitchens, which was next to Helena's room and the final room on this floor that was a pantry with various potion ingredients held in a stasis spell. That woman sure seems to love her stasis charms. Nick thought with a chuckle as he closed the door and turned to leave this hallway. Once back in the entryway, he went up the stairs to the second floor. Once again there were a series of doors on either wing, so Nick took the left wing to explore first. Chapter 199, Ravenclaw Manor, 2. The first door led to a room chock full of 1000-year-old enchantment equipment and unfinished pieces left lying on the workbench. Mother's enchanting room, Helena said, startling Nick slightly as he hadn't heard her sneak up on him thanks to her being in her ghostly form. She used to get so upset when I'd go in here without permission as a child, she said with a smile. She must not have returned here before the illness took her, or she never would have left these here, she said, floating over to the unfinished pieces on the workbench. What even was this illness, since I find it hard to believe that none of the founder could save her from it? Nick asked curiously. According to Aunt Helga, it was something called mana deprivation that she got after reaching a new level of magic thanks to one of her experiments, Helena said calmly, and Nick froze in place as he had seen that name show up recently on another very powerful thing. The golden apple tree had that very same condition, and Nick couldn't help but start to form a theory about how Helena got it as well. Somehow Rowena Ravenclaw must have learned how to reach the level beyond the one the founders were at, and her ascended body simply couldn't draw enough magic energy or mana from the surroundings, eventually causing her death. This would also explain why nothing being above a certain level of strength is still alive today like the gods, as there simply isn't enough mana to support their existences. This reminded Nick of what the opening passage of the book written by Kronos said about the planet recovering. He must have been referring to the mana concentrations in the world, but I can't tell if he meant actually soon or in like 200 years, since he probably knows about my immortality, Nick thought, frustrated. Dropping these thoughts for now, Nick turned his attention back to the matter at hand, exploring. Leaving the enchanting room, Nick went further down the hallway to the second door and opened it. It was a bedroom with fancy decorations and a large bed and all the things would expect to find in the room. This was Mother's room, though it hardly ever saw much use aside from when she needed to change clothes. Normally she would simply banish away the need for sleep with a spell or potion. Feel free to take it for yourself, as the master control for the wards are against the wall over there, Helena said while pointing to a spot on the wall. I'll have everything placed in another room since I have no want to use a second-hand bedroom, Nick said, and Helena nodded in agreement. The final room of this hallway was one that got Nick quite excited when he saw it, the library. Rows of old tomes all organized by topic and difficulty for easy perusal. Of course your face would light up at the family library. If you aren't in class, you are either reading, socializing, or forging. You are almost as much of a workaholic as my mother was, Helena teased, and Nick looked away awkwardly since he knew she was right. Closing the door, Nick walked over to the other side of the upstairs area and was surprised to find that one of the rooms was a massive indoor bath kept constantly clean and hot by the magic woven into the stones that made it up, leaving the room full of steam. The next room was basically the room of requirement from Hogwarts, except it was always available without the weird summoning thing involving pacing. The final room was, however, disturbing to find, as it was a torture chamber with all the implements one would expect such a place to have, even if there was no trace of blood within the room. I also found this room repulsive and tended to avoid it as well, Helena said after seeing the face he made after finding the room. With the inside of the house fully explored, Nick headed down to the entryway and out the door at the back of the building. Ah yes, the gardens. This was where we kept all of our living plants and magical creatures during the time the estate was in use. Helena said as Nick found himself in a huge glass enclosure that was obviously the work of space expansion enchantments. Most of the area was barren and lifeless, however, as the magical plants and animals that could had already escaped and taken over the island, while the rest likely starved to death within here. He knew this because of the crumbling bones that littered a few places as he walked through the huge room. Chapter 200, Taking Stock. Nick extended his magical senses to sweep the room for any still living entities, but having found none, he waved his wand Scourgify. He said, and a stream of magical cleaning bubbles sprayed out and went to work scouring the giant room clean. While the spell was working its magic, pun very much intended, he turned his attention to the broken glass walls of the greenhouse that he could see. The damage wasn't that bad, all things considered, as there was merely a few small holes and a single large one well hidden in the corner. Waving his wand Reparo, he spoke and the shattered glass repaired itself, returning the greenhouse to its optimal state. 10 minutes later the cleaning spell finished its work and got rid of the excess soil, dust, and stains from the various fluids that soak out of corpses. Unfortunately it didn't get rid of the bones, though it did clean them to a yellowish color. Collecting the bones that he might be able to use to make rings and banishing the rest, Nick marvels at how expansive the greenhouse actually was. It was easily the size of a football field in both width and length, while the ceiling was nearly 30 feet high. The sunlight streaming in between the vines covering the outside of the greenhouse created a mysterious twilight-like effect within the room, as if he was standing in a forest. Despite not paying much attention to Pody wondering, my mother had one of the most impressive collections of magical plants and animals for her time. It's a shame to see all of that hard work reduced almost to the point of nothingness. Makes me wonder what was so valuable about that tree we saw in the vault. Helena said with a sad expression. Nick had to stop himself from saying that the tree in the vault was worth 1,000 gardens of other normal magical plants. This was no exaggeration either, as the singular trait of the tree in the system's appraisal confused him, so he brought up its description. What it actually meant was not that this was the last one of its kind, but rather the only one of its kind to ever exist on Earth. This means that unlike all these other plants that multiply and can be raised, the tree was the be-all and all of itself. This meant that the golden apple tree was an irreplaceable and priceless treasure, and Nick very much planned to hoard it away like it was. Before any of that though, I need to get a thorough look at the island to take stock of how much needs to be cleared out and how much can be left alone, he thought before leaving the greenhouse and returning inside the manor. Dottie! He called out, and the house elf immediately popped up out of nowhere. The carriage is cleaned up as commanded. How can Dottie serve? The house elf asked eagerly. I need you to clean out all of the belongings in the master bedroom without damaging anything. Place it all in one of the spare bedrooms. Nick said, and Dottie saluted and vanished again. Looking at the large bird still sitting on his shoulder, Nick asked it to get off of him since he was starting to hurt. The ho-ho, pronounced hoo-hoo, hopped off Nick and onto the stone floors without a fuss, and Nick rolled his shoulder to try and work out the ache there as he walked out the front door of the manor. Pulling his broom out of greed, he mounted it and rose into the air easily and smoothly. He almost fell into the temptation of just soaring through the sky, but he needed to get this done as soon as possible. Rising high into the air, Nick finally got a full look at the island and was surprised at what he saw. Despite being a plant-covered mess, it was actually fairly large, as it easily covered about 10 miles in each direction from the center that had the manor. His eyes narrowed, however, when he saw the shape of the island that was suspiciously circular. It was almost like someone had perfectly cut out a massive circle from the seafloor and raised it up above the water. It might be more accurate to say that someone cut off the excess until only this circle remained, he thought seriously. Ignoring that though, he saw several different species of magical creatures on the island beyond those he came across previously. Graphorns, dryads, fairies, and even a small flock of griffcats, which were cat-sized griffin creatures at the edge of the island. The smaller things that hid in the vegetation couldn't be seen though.